Have you ever wondered what people in the Middle Ages thought was beautiful? We often imagine castles, knights, and feasts. But behind all of that, there were beauty standards that might actually shock you. Imagine women plucking out their hairline just to make their foreheads look taller, or using dangerous powders made of lead and mercury to make their skin look pale and smooth. Yes, beauty could literally be deadly. Back then, pale skin wasn't just about looking elegant. It was proof you were wealthy enough to avoid working in the sun. Rosy cheeks meant health and innocence, while a straight nose showed harmony and even moral character. Every feature of the body, from eyebrows to waistlines, carried meaning, and people went to extremes to achieve these ideals, no matter how risky or uncomfortable it was. But here's the surprising part. Even though these beauty trends sound strange, they aren't so far from the ones we see today. Just like us, people in medieval Europe used clothing, makeup, and even dangerous tricks to match what society called beautiful. Their stories remind us that beauty has always been more than appearance. It's about status, culture, and the endless human desire to belong. So tonight, let's take a slow, relaxing journey into the shocking beauty ideals of medieval Europe. You might be surprised by how much has changed, and how much has stayed the same. In medieval Europe, the idea of beauty was often tied to things that seem unusual to us today, and perhaps the most important ideal of all was pale skin. To people of that time, the paler your complexion, the more beautiful and desirable you were considered. Pale skin wasn't just about looks, though. It carried powerful meanings about wealth, class, and status. A fair complexion told the world that you were not someone who worked in the fields under the burning sun. You were not bending your back in labor or sweating in the dirt like peasants. Instead, pale skin marked you as someone with privilege, leisure, and refinement. For nobles, ladies, and even fashionable men, pale skin was the ultimate symbol that your life was elevated above hard work. Imagine a summer afternoon in a medieval town. Farmers and tradespeople moved under the bright sun, their arms tanned from days of labor. Their faces were browned by the weather, their skin roughened by wind and sun. Now, picture the wealthy lady in her long gown, moving slowly through the shaded parts of her home or cloister. Her face was shielded by hoods, veils, or even wide-brimmed hats designed to block sunlight. She had servants to fetch her water, cooks to prepare her meals, and laborers to tend her land. Because she didn't need to toil under the open sky, her skin could remain untouched by the sun. That untouched quality became part of her beauty. People looked at her and thought, "Here is someone pure, untarnished, and delicate." This obsession with pale skin meant that people often went to great lengths to protect themselves from sunlight. Women wore heavy veils not only for modesty or religious symbolism, but also as shields against the rays that might darken their complexion. Wealthy families built shaded gardens where noble women could walk without fear of tanning. Parasols or covered cloisters were prized for the same reason. Pale faces were preserved as carefully as fine fabrics. To get darker in the sun was almost shameful, a mark of lowly labor. The fascination with paleness also found its way into poetry and literature of the age. Troubadours praised ladies whose skin was described as white as ivory, pale as lilies, or glowing like moonlight. These comparisons were not accidental. To be likened to flowers, to moonlight, or to precious stone meant a woman was thought to possess an otherworldly quality, something fragile and pure, almost spiritual. A pale face was not just beautiful. It was elevated, almost sacred. Of course, not everyone could achieve this ideal naturally. Even among the wealthy, some people's skin naturally tanned in the summer, or they were born with warmer complexions. Because of this, people turned to cosmetics and tricks to keep their skin as pale as possible. In some regions, women rubbed mixtures of vinegar and lead powders onto their faces, a dangerous practice by modern standards, since lead was poisonous. But in those days, the dangers were not fully understood, and many were willing to risk their health to meet the fashion of the time. Others applied crushed chalk or flour as a kind of primitive foundation, dusting their faces white before gatherings or feasts. Some even used egg whites spread thin across the skin, which when dried gave the face a smoother, pale sheen under candlelight. Pale skin was also linked with ideas of morality. Darkness was often associated with sin, mystery, or corruption, while lightness suggested innocence and goodness. These associations were woven deeply into medieval thought, through religion, through art, through stories told from childhood. To appear pale and glowing was to show the outside world a reflection of your supposed inner purity. People often believed that beauty and virtue were connected, so a pale face could be read as evidence of a pure soul. But the ideal was not entirely realistic. Many people lived lives where some sun exposure was unavoidable, even if they were wealthy. Travel, festivals, or daily tasks sometimes meant stepping outside into daylight. Because of this, manuals of household knowledge and early beauty advice often contained tips for lightening the skin. Recipes included mixtures of milk and honey, rosewater, and herbal pastes made with herbs like fennel or parsley, believed to soothe and lighten the complexion. Bathing in warm water infused with herbs was thought to restore fairness after exposure to sun. These treatments were gentle compared to the harsher powders and paints, but they were part of the same pursuit, a skin tone as pale as possible. Men were not exempt from this standard. While it was more strongly applied to women, noblemen too were often described as handsome when they were pale and fair. Chroniclers writing about kings or young knights sometimes praised their white complexions as signs of nobility and refinement. For men, paleness suggested that they did not work with their hands like common soldiers or laborers. Instead, they lived lives of strategy, culture, or command, away from the fields and closer to books, halls, or courts. Art from the period also reflects this obsession. Illuminated manuscripts and painted icons often portrayed holy figures with luminous, pale skin. Saints, the Virgin Mary, and noble patrons were shown as fair-faced, glowing with an almost otherworldly whiteness. In portraits of noble families, skin was carefully represented as pale and soft, often in stark contrast to the darker backgrounds or clothing that surrounded the figure. Even in death, pale skin remained an ideal. Some people sought to be remembered in effigies or tomb sculptures with smooth, fair faces, frozen forever in the appearance of refinement and untouched beauty. The pressure to remain pale was especially hard for women living near the Mediterranean, where sunlight was plentiful and strong. Accounts from travelers sometimes note how women in those regions covered themselves even more carefully, layering fabrics and carrying shades, determined to protect their faces. In Northern Europe, where the sun was weaker, women may not have had to try as hard, but the value placed on paleness was no less intense. This beauty ideal also created social divisions. A tan complexion was automatically read as a sign of labor and poverty. Field workers and servants were marked by their sun-darkened skin, making it nearly impossible for them to be mistaken for noble ladies or gentlemen. In this way, beauty ideals reinforced class boundaries. Pale skin was not just admired. It was a visible symbol of the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And yet, within this system, people found ways to adapt. Some peasants or townsfolk who wished to appear wealthier than they were might experiment with powders to lighten their faces for special occasions. Others might borrow a veil or hood to at least mimic the fashion of shielding the skin. Beauty ideals, even harsh ones, always create imitation. People long for the status and admiration attached to them, even if the imitation is temporary or imperfect. Looking back now, the obsession with pale skin in medieval Europe may seem both fascinating and extreme. It reminds us that beauty standards are not fixed, but deeply tied to social and cultural meanings. In those days, pale skin wasn't only about looking pretty, it was about showing the world who you were, or at least who you wanted others to believe you were. For some, it was worth the effort, the expense, and even the risk of dangerous cosmetics. For others, it was a reminder of their place in a society that equated skin tone with worth. As the centuries moved on, these ideals shifted, but during the medieval period, pale skin was a crown you wore on your face, a silent announcement of privilege, purity, and beauty. The pale complexion was the canvas on which all other medieval ideals of beauty were painted. Whether through nature, careful shielding, or powders made in secret, people pursued it endlessly, because to be pale was to be perfect. In the medieval world, beauty was often measured by details that might surprise us today, and one of the most curious of these ideals was the fashion for very high foreheads. To us, it may seem unusual, even strange, but for women of that time, a tall and open forehead was considered the height of elegance. The higher and smoother the forehead, the more refined and noble a woman appeared. Artists, poets, and even chroniclers praised it, and women went to great lengths to achieve this look, even if it meant enduring discomfort and altering their natural appearance in ways that sound uncomfortable now. The idea of a high forehead had roots in symbolism as much as in fashion. In medieval thought, the forehead was connected to the mind, and the mind was connected to virtue, wisdom, and purity. A broad, smooth forehead suggested intelligence, self-control, and noble qualities. Just as pale skin suggested purity and privilege, a tall forehead suggested refinement of spirit. People came to believe that the larger the forehead, the more space there was for wisdom, grace, and noble thoughts. It became a visible mark of elegance, something that could be admired by others at a glance. Because of this belief, many women deliberately changed their natural hairlines to create the illusion of a larger forehead. They plucked away hairs at the edge of their scalp, sometimes with tweezers made of metal or bone. Others went further, using small razors or sharp blades to shave the hairline back, exposing more skin above the eyebrows. This practice could be uncomfortable, leaving the skin red or tender, but it was worth it to match the beauty ideal. The process was not a one-time effort either. Hair grows back, and so women repeated this routine, keeping their foreheads free of hair week after week. Eyebrows also came under attack in the pursuit of this look. Thin brows were considered fashionable, and in some cases, women removed them completely. A bare expanse of skin from hairline to eyelids made the forehead look taller and smoother, further enhancing the prized aesthetic. It was not uncommon for noblewomen to sit for hours with attendants, carefully plucking each stray hair. In some records, there are even mentions of ointments made with herbs or ashes that were believed to slow hair growth, a primitive attempt at what we might call cosmetic science. The fashion for high foreheads was not only a matter of personal vanity, it was reinforced by art and literature. Painters of the time often portrayed noblewomen with strikingly high hairlines, exaggerating the effect to match the taste of the era. Portraits show faces framed by elaborate headdresses and veils, with the forehead stretched wide and smooth, glowing in pale tones. Poets, too, sang praises of women whose foreheads resembled shining marble or radiant moons. These artistic choices did not merely reflect beauty ideals, they also shaped them, encouraging women to follow the same practices to match the images celebrated in culture. Hairstyles were carefully arranged to highlight the forehead. Instead of bangs or curls that might fall forward, women brushed their hair tightly back, often covering it with nets, caps, or veils that left the forehead completely bare. Some wore padded rolls or tall headdresses that pushed the hairline back even further, creating a frame that emphasized the face's upper half. The effect was striking, a long, pale forehead stretching upward, giving the impression of dignity and grace. It wasn't always easy to maintain this look. Medieval tools were crude compared to what we have today. Tweezers were often imprecise, and razors were not finely made. Skin could be irritated, scratched, or even infected by the constant plucking and shaving. Still, women endured it, encouraged by the admiration such features inspired. To walk into a court or gathering with a perfectly high forehead was to signal that you were cultured, aware of fashion, and willing to devote time and effort to your appearance. There are stories of how far some women would go. In wealthier households, attendants were sometimes tasked specifically with managing the lady's hairline. This meant long sessions of plucking, shaving, and smoothing, ensuring that no hair dared creep back to spoil the effect. Some women even used small cloths soaked in vinegar or herbal waters to rub the skin afterward, both to soothe it and to give the forehead a slight sheen. Others dusted their foreheads with pale powder to make them appear even larger and more luminous under candlelight. The obsession with foreheads also connected with the broader theme of control over the body. In a world where women's lives were often restricted by social and religious expectations, appearance became one of the few realms where they could express refinement and power. By reshaping their hairlines, they were, in a sense, reshaping how others perceived them. A woman with a tall forehead was not just beautiful, she was marked as noble, graceful, and worthy of admiration. Of course, not everyone admired this look. There must have been those who found it strange or unappealing, especially among peasants who had little time for such fashions. To a farmer or merchant's wife, plucking out one's hairline might have seemed wasteful or even foolish. But among the upper classes, where appearance carried social weight, the trend was taken seriously. Even men sometimes joined in praising the look, reinforcing the idea that it was the proper standard of beauty. In many ways, this forehead fashion reminds us that beauty ideals are never fixed. They are shaped by culture, symbolism, and the values of a particular time. In the medieval period, wisdom, virtue, and refinement were deeply prized, and the body was used as a canvas to display those values. Just as today's standards encourage people to emphasize different features, so too did the past create its own unusual practices. The high forehead may seem odd to us, but to medieval eyes, it was the sign of a perfect lady. If we imagine a grand banquet in a medieval hall, lit by flickering torches and filled with richly dressed guests, we can picture the scene. The noblewomen are seated in rows, their gowns heavy with fabric and jewels. Their hair is brushed back tightly, hidden beneath veils and elaborate headdresses. Candlelight glows on their pale faces, and what strikes you most is the smooth, bare expanse of forehead above each pair of eyes. It looks almost unreal, like something sculpted rather than natural. And in that world, it is considered beautiful, a mark of distinction. The pursuit of high foreheads also shows how beauty was connected to effort and sacrifice. To maintain such a look, women endured pain, inconvenience, and constant vigilance. It was not natural, but constructed, and that construction sent a message. I have the time, the means, and the will to shape myself into what society values. In that sense, it was not so different from modern beauty practices that require hours of work and even risk. The tools have changed, but the desire to match the ideal has not. Looking back, it is easy to smile at the oddity of it all. Shaving or plucking away your natural hairline seems unnecessary, even absurd. But when we remember the meanings attached to it, wisdom, purity, refinement, it becomes easier to understand why people valued it so highly. In their world, a tall forehead was more than a piece of fashion. It was a symbol written on the body, telling a story about who you were, or at least who you hoped to be seen as. And so, through pain, patience, and careful presentation, medieval women transformed their faces to meet an ideal that belonged to their age. Today, when we look at their portraits or read their poems, we see something strange. But for them, it was beauty. For them, it was perfection. In medieval Europe, beauty ideals often centered on features that seem unusual to us now. And one of the strangest of all was the fashion for eyebrows, or rather, the lack of them. Today, eyebrows are seen as important markers of expression and style, with endless techniques for shaping, filling, and grooming them. But in the Middle Ages, the trend leaned in a completely different direction. Thin eyebrows, or in some cases no visible eyebrows at all, were seen as the height of elegance. To have a bare, smooth expanse of skin above the eyes was considered refined and noble, a look that distinguished fashionable women from everyone else. This fashion was closely tied to the forehead ideal we explored earlier. The high, pale, open forehead was seen as a symbol of beauty, and eyebrows were obstacles to this effect. They interrupted the smoothness of the skin. They drew attention away from the glowing paleness of the face, and they could make the forehead look smaller. By thinning or removing the brows, women created an uninterrupted canvas stretching from hairline to eyelids, one that seemed to radiate purity and refinement. The process of achieving this look was both tedious and uncomfortable. Women often plucked individual hairs with small tweezers, which could take hours. In some cases, they went further and shaved the brows entirely, using razors or sharp blades. Just as they removed hair from the hairline to enlarge the forehead, they removed or thinned the eyebrows to exaggerate the effect even more. What remained was a blank, pale surface that seemed almost otherworldly, smooth like marble or ivory. Why would such a strange fashion become so popular? Part of the answer lies in symbolism. Medieval thought often associated hair with wildness, sensuality, and disorder. Too much visible hair on a woman's face or body was seen as unrefined, even improper. By removing the brows, women signaled control, discipline, and modesty. A bare brow reflected the idea that beauty was not natural, but carefully shaped to show moral and social status. It also tied into the fascination with purity and innocence, since a hairless face could look almost childlike. Another reason came from the art and literature of the time. Painters often depicted noble ladies and saints with thin or missing brows, their faces glowing with serene calm. This wasn't just artistic choice, it reflected the actual ideals of their society. A smooth forehead without eyebrows looked gentle, spiritual, and detached from the roughness of everyday life. To men writing poetry, the image of a pale, hairless face was likened to moonlight or to delicate ivory carvings. Such imagery encouraged women to follow the trend, knowing that their beauty would be praised in the same language. Of course, not everyone could achieve this ideal without effort. Eyebrows grow back and quickly. To maintain the look, women had to commit to constant grooming. Attendants in noble households often helped with this process, spending hours plucking or trimming. Some women even experimented with ointments and mixtures to slow hair growth. There are references to concoctions made from walnut oil, vinegar, or herbs thought to weaken the follicles. Whether these worked is doubtful, but the attempts show how dedicated people were to sustaining the fashion. There are also darker sides to this practice. Removing eyebrows entirely could leave the skin irritated, sore, or even infected. Without modern tools or knowledge of hygiene, women sometimes damage their skin in the pursuit of smoothness. Yet these risks were accepted because beauty came at a price. Just as some later centuries would use dangerous powders or toxic cosmetics, the medieval world had its own sacrifices, small and large, in service of appearance. Eyebrow fashion also played a role in distinguishing classes. Among peasants and common folk, there was little time or means for such detailed grooming. Their faces reflected the reality of work and weather, not the polished ideals of nobility. Smooth, bare brows signaled that a woman belonged to a higher status, that she had servants, time, and wealth enough to devote herself to careful grooming. It was, once again, a beauty standard that doubled as a marker of privilege. Interestingly, this trend was not universal across all of Europe at all times. In some regions, fuller brows were tolerated or even admired, especially in rural areas. But in courts, noble households, and cultural centers, the fashion for thin or missing brows dominated. Portraits and effigies from the late Middle Ages often show women with faint, nearly invisible lines where their brows should be. Sometimes a very light hint of pigment was added, almost like a shadow, to suggest a brow without spoiling the smoothness of the forehead. In some cases, women may have drawn in extremely thin lines with charcoal or herbs, just enough to frame the eyes without creating the impression of natural fullness. The absence of eyebrows also affected the way faces were read. With so little hair above the eyes, expressions appeared calmer, less emotional. The face looked serene, almost detached, which fit perfectly with the ideal of noble composure. A woman with smooth brows seemed less likely to show raw feelings like anger or sorrow. Her face became a mask of elegance, a canvas of pale skin unbroken by rough lines. In a world where emotions were often associated with weakness or chaos, this controlled blank expression carried weight. One can imagine the effect at a gathering or banquet. Rows of noble ladies seated along the walls, their faces framed by heavy veils and jeweled headdresses, pale and smooth from forehead to chin. Their brows faint or absent, their eyes glinting under torchlight, their foreheads glowing in powder and candlelight. To us, the effect might appear eerie, even unsettling, but to the medieval eye, it was perfection, the very image of grace and refinement. The strange brow trend also teaches us something about how beauty standards are formed. They are not about practicality or natural features, but about what society decides to value at a given moment. In the Middle Ages, value was placed on purity, control, and separation from labor. A bare forehead and missing brows symbolized those qualities, no matter how strange it might look to us now. And, like all beauty standards, it was reinforced by repetition. The more people saw women with smooth, high foreheads and faint brows, the more it became the accepted image of elegance. Artists painted it, poets praised it, noble families expected it, and women pursued it. Over time, it became part of the cultural memory of what beauty was supposed to look like. Of course, fashions change. By later centuries, eyebrows returned in fuller, more expressive forms. Artists of the Renaissance, for instance, often painted women with thin but visible brows, adding delicacy rather than erasing them completely. But in the medieval period, the strange brow trend reigned. It was one of those unique markers of its age, a reminder that beauty is never fixed, but always shifting with the values of society. Looking back today, it is easy to be amused by this fashion. The idea of plucking away eyebrows completely, only to create a blank, pale forehead, feels almost alien to us. Yet, at the same time, it is not so different from the lengths people still go to in order to match modern ideals. Hours of makeup, cosmetic treatments, even surgery. The tools have changed, but the willingness to endure discomfort for beauty remains the same. The medieval brow trend shows us just how much people were willing to shape themselves to match an idea. It was not natural beauty they valued, but controlled beauty, shaped by discipline and effort. In the end, the smooth, bare forehead and invisible brows were not only about appearance, they were a statement. I belong to the world of elegance, refinement, and nobility. I am not common. I am something rarer, higher, and more refined. And so, for centuries, the strange fashion of thin or missing brows marked faces across Europe. Faces that to us may seem strange, even ghostly, but that to their own time were the very model of beauty. In the Middle Ages, one of the strongest and most enduring ideals of beauty was the idea of long hair. To medieval people, hair was not just something to cover the head or frame the face. It carried deep symbolism, spiritual meaning, and social value. And among all kinds of hair, the most admired was long, flowing hair, particularly when it was golden or fair in color. Hair like sunlight was praised in songs and poetry, painted in art, and described in chronicles as a sign of purity, youth, and almost magical charm. The fascination with long hair was tied to many layers of meaning. To begin with, hair was one of the few parts of the body that could grow endlessly, a sign of vitality and life. A woman whose hair stretched long down her back, who could coil it in thick braids or let it spill like a river, seemed to embody health and natural beauty. Hair was not just an accessory. It was a living crown that grew from within, and the longer it was, the more it spoke of patience, care, and vitality. Golden or fair hair, in particular, carried special importance. In medieval symbolism, light colors were often associated with purity and goodness. Just as pale skin was linked with innocence, golden hair reminded people of sunlight, angels, and divine radiance. In literature, heroines were often described with hair like spun gold, or like the rays of dawn. Troubadours sang verses praising ladies with golden locks, comparing them to the brightness of summer fields or the glow of holy icons. A woman with fair, long hair was not only beautiful, but almost saint-like in her appearance, as if heaven itself had brushed her with its light. This admiration for long, golden hair did not mean that women simply let their hair grow without care. In fact, medieval hair care was surprisingly detailed. Women who could afford it treated their hair as one of their most precious assets. Washing was done with care, often using herbal rinses. Infusions of rosemary, chamomile, or nettle were popular, not only for their scent but for their supposed ability to strengthen hair and add shine. Chamomile, in particular, was believed to lighten hair slightly, making fair tones even brighter under the sun. Vinegar mixed with herbs might also be used to rinse the scalp, keeping it clean and glossy. These methods may seem rustic, but they were the medieval equivalent of beauty treatments, repeated with patience over weeks and months. After washing, hair was carefully dried, often with the help of servants who would comb and detangle the strands while they were still damp. Combs were usually made of wood, bone, or horn, carved with fine teeth to separate knots. A lady's chamber might have several such combs, some plain and others decorated, because the act of combing was not just about beauty, it was also considered soothing and almost ritual-like. A woman sitting while her hair was combed and braided was a scene of peace and elegance, often captured in medieval art. Braiding was one of the most common ways to manage long hair. Thick braids could be wound into circles and pinned, hidden under veils, or tucked into nets known as cauls. Noblewomen often wove ribbons, beads, or even threads of gold into their braids, making them shimmer with each movement. For special occasions, elaborate styles might include 2 long braids looped and wrapped in colored silk, creating patterns that looked both practical and luxurious. The braid itself became a sign of refinement, showing that a woman's hair was long enough and healthy enough to weave into such intricate shapes. Still, the most admired image of hair was when it was left loose. This was not common in daily life because modesty and social rules required women to cover their hair in public once they reached adulthood or married. A veil, hood, or wimple was the proper fashion for most respectable women outside the home. But in private moments or in symbolic contexts, the sight of a woman's long, loose hair carried great emotional power. Brides, for instance, sometimes wore their hair down during wedding ceremonies as a symbol of youth, virginity, and the transition into married life. Religious art often portrayed the Virgin Mary or female saints with flowing hair, giving them an image of both humility and divine beauty. In literature, the moment when a lady unbound her hair could represent trust, vulnerability, or intimacy, an image reserved for poetry and private imagination. There were also curious contradictions in how long hair was seen. On the one hand, it was admired and celebrated as a sign of beauty and virtue. On the other hand, church leaders often warned that loose hair could also be a source of temptation, a symbol of vanity or even sin. Priests preached that women should cover their hair in church, since uncovered hair might draw inappropriate attention. Yet even those same sermons often admitted that hair had a special power, one that could not be denied. In this way, long hair became both a symbol of holiness and a sign of earthly attraction, depending on how it was worn. Because golden hair was so prized, women with darker hair sometimes sought ways to lighten it. While bleaching as we know it didn't exist, natural methods were attempted. Spending time in the sun after rinsing with chamomile or lemon-infused water was believed to create a brighter, lighter shade. Some recipes called for mixtures of saffron or even onion skins to bring out highlights. While results may have been modest, the effort shows how strongly people desired that golden hue, even if their natural color was brown or black. In noble courts, stories often spread about women whose beauty was defined almost entirely by their hair. Chronicles mention queens and duchesses described as radiant with hair like the morning, and their names became tied to their appearance in memory. Hair was not just decoration, it was an identity, a way a woman could be remembered and praised for centuries. Even in medieval romances, knights often carried a lady's hair ribbon or a strand of her braid as a token, believing it represented her spirit and presence. Taking care of long hair was not easy, especially in times when daily bathing was rare. Hair could grow heavy, tangled, or greasy if neglected. That is why rituals of combing, braiding, and washing became so important. A woman's attendants might spend hours each week simply maintaining her hair. For wealthier families, this was worth the effort, since the result was not just beauty, but also status. A lady with flowing golden hair showed that she had the time, help, and means to maintain it. It became another symbol of wealth and refinement, just like pale skin or fine clothing. Hair also played a role in storytelling and legends. In some tales, magical women or enchantresses were described with impossibly long hair that could be used as ropes or veils. In other stories, hair was a source of power. Cutting it off symbolized loss, while growing it long represented strength. These themes show how deeply medieval people connected hair with identity and fate. Even in religious stories, saints sometimes cut their hair as a sign of renouncing earthly beauty, while others were remembered for the beauty of their locks. Looking back, it is easy to see how much meaning was placed on something that grew naturally from the body. Hair became a canvas for ideals, a way to display purity, wealth, health, or devotion. Golden, long hair was the standard against which all others were measured, even though not everyone could meet it. Those who could not sometimes imitated the effect with ribbons, extensions, or even wigs made from real hair. But the admiration remained strongest for the natural, flowing locks that seemed touched by sunlight. Today, when we see medieval paintings or read poems praising hair like gold, we might think it was simply a matter of color. But for the people of that time, it was much more than that. Long, golden hair was a symbol of all that was ideal in a woman: beauty, youth, virtue, purity, and sometimes even divine favor. It was a treasure carried on the head, carefully maintained, carefully hidden, and carefully revealed only at the right moments. And so, through herbs, braids, veils, and songs, medieval women nurtured their hair, letting it grow as long as it could, weaving it into the culture of their age. It was not just fashion. It was power, identity, and an endless source of admiration, stretching like the strands themselves through every part of medieval life. In medieval Europe, lips carried their own language of beauty. Among all the features of the face, they held a special place because they were associated with speech, song, and the warmth of human expression. A woman's lips could be praised in poetry, painted lovingly in manuscript art, or whispered about in stories of courtly love. The ideal lips were soft, delicate, and gently tinted with color. Red lips, in particular, became a sign of youth, health, and charm. But like all beauty ideals of the time, there was a fine line to walk. A touch of color could elevate a woman's appearance to elegance, but too much could cross into suspicion, vanity, or even accusations of immorality. For most women, the natural color of the lips was not enough to match the fashionable image. Life in the Middle Ages was harsh, and the climate, diet, and lack of modern comforts often left faces pale and lips dry or dull. To create the desired effect, women turned to simple methods of enhancing their lips with color. They didn't have modern lipsticks, but they did have natural dyes, herbs, and household ingredients that could add a subtle flush. One of the most common methods was to use crushed berries. Raspberries, strawberries, or blackberries, when mashed, left behind a soft stain that could be dabbed onto the lips. The effect was gentle and short-lived, but it was enough to create the illusion of freshness and vitality. In some regions, women used the juice of beets or red roots, which left a deeper, longer-lasting tint. These stains had to be applied carefully because too much could look unnatural. And in a society that valued restraint, anything too bold risked drawing unwanted attention. Herbal mixtures were also popular. Red sandalwood powder, when available through trade, was mixed with oils or animal fats to create a balm that gave lips a rosy sheen. In wealthier households, exotic spices like saffron or cochineal could be used, though these were expensive and reserved for the elite. For those with fewer means, local herbs and flowers provided small amounts of color. Rose petals, crushed and mixed with honey or wax, created a sweet paste that could moisten and tint the lips at the same time. The rose, already a symbol of love and beauty, became a practical tool in beauty rituals. But in all of this, moderation was essential. A woman with lips too brightly red might be accused of using cosmetics excessively, which was frowned upon by both religious leaders and society. The church, in particular, warned against women painting their faces, suggesting it was deceitful, an attempt to mislead others about one's natural state. Sermons sometimes mocked women who wore bold colors on their lips or cheeks, comparing them to temptresses or even witches. The idea was that natural beauty reflected purity and godliness, while painted beauty risked association with vanity, sin, or lust. Because of this, women had to walk a delicate path. They wanted enough color to look lively and elegant, but not so much that they seemed vain or artificial. The ideal was a soft flush, something that could be mistaken for natural health. In fact, red lips were often associated with vitality and fertility, signs that a woman was youthful and strong. A pale mouth could suggest illness or weakness, while a gentle tint of red suggested the opposite. This is why poets described their beloved's lips as rosy, like cherries, or soft as coral. These metaphors painted an image of life and freshness, not of painted exaggeration. Practical tricks also played a role. Some women bit their lips lightly before entering a gathering, a quick way to bring blood to the surface and create a natural redness. Others rubbed their lips with cloths dipped in warm water or wine to encourage color. These small, temporary methods were safe, required no ingredients, and gave the impression of health without risk of being accused of painting one's face. Attendants in noble households might quietly prepare small jars of berry juice or herbal balms for their mistresses, tools to be used discreetly and without fanfare. For the upper classes, lip color was tied closely to fashion and presentation at court. A noblewoman appearing at a banquet or ceremony might have taken great care with her appearance, ensuring her lips looked softly red to complement her pale skin and high forehead. A faint tint gave her the glow of youth, which was highly valued in societies where alliances and marriages were deeply political. Beauty was not only a personal matter, but also a symbol of family prestige. Lips, small though they might seem, were part of that larger display. The fascination with red lips also appeared in art and literature. In illuminated manuscripts, ladies were sometimes painted with tiny touches of vermilion on their lips, just enough to make them stand out from pale faces. Troubadour poetry often lingered on the mouth as a place of sweetness and song. A lady's lips were praised not only for their appearance but for their words, gentle speech, refined wit, or musical voice. Red lips symbolized not only beauty, but also the charm of conversation and the allure of love songs. Yet the suspicion of too much red never faded. Women who exaggerated their lip color risked being gossiped about. They might be accused of trying to seduce men or of pretending to a youth they no longer possessed. This fear of overpainting was so strong that even noblewomen often kept their beauty rituals private. To be caught in the act of applying berry juice or herbal balm could invite whispers of vanity. For this reason, lip coloring was often subtle, done in chambers before public appearances, and carefully maintained to avoid looking obvious. The Church's warnings did not stop the practice, of course. Human desire for beauty has always found ways to slip past rules, but the tension between natural and artificial remained a powerful influence. The most admired look was the one that seemed effortless, even if it required careful preparation. A noblewoman might spend hours preparing herself, yet hope that others believed her lips were naturally rosy. The compliment she sought was not, "What have you put on?" but, "How radiant she looks." Even men, though less concerned with cosmetics, were drawn to the image of red lips. Chroniclers describing noblemen sometimes noted their health and vigor in terms of ruddy lips, though this was rare. For men, lip color was less a matter of fashion and more a sign of physical strength. Still, the admiration of red lips was not limited to women. It tied into a broader association of color with vitality and life, something everyone valued. Looking back, the medieval love of red lips shows how much meaning can be attached to a small feature. It was not just about beauty, but about health, morality, and social standing. Lips were a canvas on which people read signs of youth, refinement, or vanity. They were praised in poems, painted in art, and whispered about in sermons. A little color brought admiration, too much brought suspicion. Today, the idea of using berries or herbs as makeup might seem quaint, even charming. But for medieval women, it was a serious matter, tied to the expectations of their society. Every choice carried meaning, and every shade of red could say something about who they were or who they wished to be seen as. In a world where beauty was never just about looks, the color of the lips became another piece of the puzzle, another sign that told a story about class, virtue, and desire. And so, in candlelit chambers and behind the veils of noble halls, women dabbed berry juice, crushed petals, or herbal balms on their lips, creating the gentle flush that the world expected of them. It was a careful balance between nature and art, between health and temptation, between admiration and suspicion. Red lips, but not too red. That was the rule, the warning, and the ideal of medieval beauty. In medieval Europe, the human body itself was often seen as a canvas for beauty, and one of the most striking ideals that emerged was the desire for a small, narrow waist. A tiny waist suggested refinement, elegance, and control, and people found many ways to shape the body to meet this vision. Though the corset, as we think of it today, did not fully exist until later centuries, early forms of body-shaping garments were already in use, and the idea of lacing or binding the waist into a slimmer shape was deeply tied to medieval notions of fashion and beauty. The fascination with the narrow waist was connected to broader ideas about the human form. In medieval art and literature, beauty was often associated with harmony and proportion. A woman's figure was admired when it curved gracefully, when it suggested softness and delicacy. The waist, as the narrowest point of the body, became a key feature to emphasize. A slim middle made the chest appear fuller and the hips more rounded, creating a silhouette that artists and poets alike praised as ideal. A narrow waist was not just a physical trait. It was a symbol of balance, health, and femininity. Clothing played a central role in creating this effect. Women's gowns in the Middle Ages were long, heavy, and layered, but beneath the outer garments there were fitted underdresses and bodices designed to shape the figure. These undergarments were sometimes reinforced with stiff fabric, tightened with laces that pulled the material snugly around the torso. The result was an early version of what we might think of as a corset, something that did not simply cover the body but actively shaped it. Lacing was key to this process. Unlike buttons or hooks, which were rare and expensive, laces allowed clothing to be adjusted tightly. A gown could be pulled in at the sides, the front, or the back, depending on the design, cinching the waist closer to the ideal. For wealthy women, these garments were custom-made to their bodies, ensuring that the lacing emphasized the curves in just the right places. For those of lower status, simpler lacing was used, but the desire to show a shaped waist still existed. Even if the result was less dramatic, it signaled awareness of the fashion and the cultural value attached to it. The effort to achieve a tiny waist was not without discomfort. Tight lacing restricted movement and breathing, especially when worn for long hours. It was a reminder that beauty often demanded sacrifice. Women endured the pressure because the reward was admiration, status, and alignment with the ideals of their time. At court, a lady with a narrow waist stood out as fashionable and desirable, her body shaped into the silhouette that matched the poetry of the age. The desire for a tiny waist also carried symbolic meaning. In a society that valued discipline and restraint, the ability to shape one's body into controlled lines was seen as a reflection of inner virtue. A woman who allowed her body to appear loose or unshaped might be accused of being careless or indulgent. In contrast, one who tightened her waist and molded her form signaled refinement and self-control. In this sense, the body itself became a moral statement, its shape reflecting the values expected of noble women. It is important to remember that clothing was also a form of social distinction. The tiny waist ideal was not easily achieved by those who labored daily in the fields. Working women needed freedom of movement, and their clothes were practical rather than decorative. The narrow waist, shaped by layers of laced fabric, became a marker of wealth and privilege. Only those who could afford not to work physically could maintain such fashions. Once again, beauty ideals reinforced class divisions, telling the world at a glance who was noble and who was not. Artists and writers amplified this ideal. In illuminated manuscripts and courtly romances, heroines were often described with slender middles, or waists like reeds. The comparison to delicate plants or natural symbols highlighted both the fragility and elegance expected of women. Painters showed noble ladies in gowns that flared dramatically at the hips while narrowing at the waist, creating an hourglass shape that emphasized their refinement. These images were aspirational, reinforcing the idea that this was the form every noble woman should strive to display. The role of fashion in shaping the waist also shifted over time. In some centuries, looser gowns with flowing lines were popular, but even then, belts or sashes were used to draw attention to the waistline. A belt, worn tightly under the bust or around the waist, emphasized the narrowness of the torso, even if the gown itself was voluminous. This created the illusion of slimness while still allowing the flowing fabric to move gracefully. In this way, fashion adapted to maintain the narrow waist ideal, even as styles of dress evolved. Beyond clothing, there were small tricks women used to appear slimmer. Standing posture was crucial. Women were trained to carry themselves with straight backs, shoulders relaxed, and stomachs pulled in. A confident, upright posture made the waist seem smaller and the figure more elegant. At social gatherings, women often sat or stood in positions that accentuated their waists, arranging their gowns so that the lacing or belt drew the eye. Beauty was not just in the body itself, but in the way it was presented. As with many beauty practices, there was a darker side. Excessive tightness could cause physical strain. Medieval medical texts occasionally mentioned concerns about women who laced their garments too tightly, warning that it could restrict breathing or cause discomfort. While these warnings were not widespread, they show that people noticed the toll such fashions could take. Still, the desire for admiration often outweighed the risks, and the practice continued, evolving into even stricter corsetry in later centuries. The tiny waist was not only admired in women. Men, too, sometimes pursued a fitted silhouette. Noblemen wore doublets and tunics that were laced tightly to create a trim waistline, giving them an athletic, controlled appearance. For men, the ideal was not fragility, but discipline and strength. A narrow waist emphasized broad shoulders and a powerful chest, signaling martial readiness as well as refinement. Thus, while the cultural meanings differed slightly, both men and women shaped their bodies to align with the ideal of a narrow middle. The symbolism of the waist also extended into metaphors of morality and order. A small waist represented control, harmony, and proper boundaries. Just as a house needed strong walls or a kingdom needed firm borders, the body needed disciplined shaping. In poems and songs, lovers praised waists as delicate as vines or slender as reeds, celebrating the elegance of control embodied in the human form. If we imagine a medieval hall filled with nobles, the effect of this ideal becomes clearer. Ladies in tightly laced gowns move gracefully, their waists drawn into slim lines that make their figures appear almost sculpted. Gentlemen in fitted doublets walk proudly, their trim silhouettes emphasizing strength and poise. The atmosphere is one of elegance, each body shaped and dressed to display the values of refinement, control, and status. To the medieval eye, this was beauty perfected, a harmony of fabric, flesh, and discipline. Looking back, the tiny waist ideal reminds us how much effort societies place on shaping the body to fit cultural visions of beauty. It was not enough to be healthy or natural. One had to appear disciplined, refined, and aligned with the aesthetics of the time. The waist became a focal point, a place where beauty and morality met, and where clothing served as both tool and symbol. Today, we might see the lacing and binding of medieval garments as an early step in a long history of corsetry and body shaping. The practices grew stricter in later centuries, but their roots were already visible in the Middle Ages. And, just like now, people were willing to endure discomfort, even pain, to present their bodies in the way society admired most. The tiny waist ideal, then, was not just about appearance. It was about class, control, discipline, and the endless human desire to embody beauty, even when it required reshaping the natural body into something closer to art. In the medieval imagination, a narrow waist was not only lovely, it was a sign of who you were and what you represented, stitched and laced into the very fabric of your life. In medieval Europe, another beauty ideal that may surprise us today was the admiration for small feet. Just as a narrow waist or a pale complexion carried meaning beyond simple appearance, tiny feet became symbols of refinement, delicacy, and noble identity. To walk with small, careful steps was considered graceful, while large or sturdy feet were linked with labor, travel, or work in the fields. The size of the foot, something we rarely think about as a marker of beauty now, carried powerful social meaning in the world of the Middle Ages. The importance of small feet was tied to ideas of class and lifestyle. Noblewomen were expected to live lives of elegance and restraint, spending their days in courts, gardens, and chambers, not in fields or workshops. Their movements were supposed to be slow, refined, and graceful. Small feet fit perfectly into this picture. They suggested that a woman did not need to walk long distances or endure the hardships of rough terrain. Instead, her feet carried her only across polished floors, through shaded courtyards, or along the soft paths of private gardens. Small feet, in this sense, became a sign of privilege as much as beauty. Shoes played a large role in shaping and displaying this ideal. In the earlier Middle Ages, shoes were often simple, made of soft leather and cut close to the shape of the foot. For noble families, shoemakers crafted elegant versions that could be pointed or decorated, emphasizing the smallness of the wearer's feet. As fashion evolved, pointed shoes called poulaines became extremely popular. These shoes had long, narrow tips that extended beyond the actual toes, sometimes to exaggerated lengths. The very impracticality of such shoes sent a message. The wearer was not expected to labor or travel by foot. Only someone of wealth and status could afford to wear shoes that valued appearance over function. Small, dainty feet slipped into narrow shoes became a visible mark of refinement. Writers of the time often reinforced this standard. Courtly poetry praised women who moved with delicate steps, or feet as light as birds. These descriptions were not just about walking. They symbolized grace, femininity, and elegance. A lady's small feet were often linked to her overall refinement, as if each part of her body spoke the same language of delicacy. The contrast was clear. Where a peasant's sturdy feet told the story of labor and endurance, a noblewoman's small steps told the story of beauty, leisure, and privilege. But small feet were not only admired in women. Men, too, sometimes sought to display elegance in their footwear. A nobleman with narrow, pointed shoes and light steps could signal sophistication, though the cultural weight was far greater for women. For men, feet were more often linked with power and movement, but in refined circles, dainty or narrow shoes still suggested wealth and fashion. Maintaining small-looking feet required some care. Because people walked more than we do today, even nobles risked developing calluses or broadening their feet through travel. Women of higher status often avoided long journeys on foot whenever possible, traveling by horse, carriage, or litter instead. This limited the strain on their feet and allowed them to preserve their dainty appearance. When they did walk, they moved slowly, sometimes supported by attendants, their steps short and measured. To take small steps was itself seen as proper behavior, a reflection of modesty and restraint. Quick or long strides were considered unfeminine, while short, delicate movements were praised. The fascination with small feet also had a practical element in clothing. Medieval gowns were long and heavy, often trailing along the floor. Only the tips of shoes or the slightest glimpse of a foot might be visible as a woman walked. That fleeting sight became part of her allure, and the smaller and more refined the shoe, the more elegant the impression. Imagine a banquet hall with women moving across the floor in rich gowns, the faintest flicker of pointed shoes peeking from beneath the fabric. Each glimpse reinforced the idea of small, dainty feet hidden within. As with many beauty ideals, there was a spiritual dimension as well. Some religious texts and sermons praised women who moved with quiet, modest steps, associating this behavior with humility and purity. Large, heavy footsteps could be linked with arrogance or lack of control, while light steps suggested modesty and grace. In art, female saints were often depicted as moving gently or standing with feet hidden or minimized, reinforcing the cultural ideal that a woman's beauty included delicacy in her movements. Of course, not everyone could match this standard. Peasant women, whose lives required long hours in the fields, naturally developed stronger, sturdier feet. Their shoes were practical, built for work rather than appearance, and they had no luxury of moving slowly or taking tiny steps. This contrast only reinforced the association between small feet and nobility. The ideal was less about reality and more about symbolism. Small feet represented a life of refinement, no matter what the actual size might be. Stories and legends also played with the symbolism of feet. In fairy tales and romances, heroines were often recognized or chosen for their delicate feet. Tales of shoes that only fit the rightful bride or beloved often carried this theme, where the size and elegance of the foot revealed the true worth of the woman. While these stories took imaginative form, they reflected real cultural values, reminding audiences that dainty feet were marks of beauty and destiny. Maintaining the appearance of small feet could also involve little tricks. Some women wore shoes slightly shorter than their feet, training themselves to move carefully and giving the illusion of smaller size. Others used soft padding within shoes to mold the shape more narrowly. The discomfort was overlooked because the result aligned with the admired ideal. As with tight lacing around the waist, small sacrifices of comfort were accepted in pursuit of beauty. At gatherings and ceremonies, attention to feet was subtle but real. Musicians might praise a noblewoman's dancing, noting her light steps on the floor. Observers might comment on the elegance of her shoes, crafted in fine colors and delicate shapes. The connection between movement, footwear, and beauty was constantly reinforced, making the feet an important, though often overlooked, part of medieval aesthetics. Looking back now, the medieval admiration for small feet may seem strange, almost trivial. Yet in its own time, it carried deep meaning. Feet were not only functional, they were symbols of refinement, class, and character. To have small feet was to show that you lived a life apart from labor, that your movements were graceful, and that your appearance matched the ideals celebrated in art and poetry. Today, when we read about these ideals, it reminds us that beauty has always been about more than appearance. It is about what society values, what it chooses to elevate and praise. In the Middle Ages, small feet told a story of privilege, elegance, and restraint. They were admired not for what they could do, but for what they represented. A delicate step across the floor of a noble hall, a fleeting glimpse beneath a gown, a sign that the person moving so gently was part of a world above ordinary life. And so, the importance of small feet endured as one of the many curious and revealing beauty ideals of medieval Europe, reminding us once again how people shaped not only their faces and bodies, but also their movements and even their steps, to match the vision of elegance cherished in their time. In the Middle Ages, hands were more than tools for work. They were often noticed as signs of beauty, refinement, and social standing. A pair of delicate hands, pale and smooth, carried as much symbolic weight as a fair face or a slender waist. To have soft hands with no calluses was to show the world that you lived a life of privilege, one untouched by the roughness of labor. Just as pale skin marked someone as noble, so too did fine, well-kept hands reveal a person's status and refinement. The fascination with hands makes sense when we remember how visible they are in daily life. Faces might be hidden by veils, hair covered by wimples, and bodies wrapped in layers of cloth, but hands were often exposed. At a feast, a noblewoman raised her cup with hands that guests could admire. During greetings or ceremonies, hands were extended, kissed, or touched. In dance, hands were joined, and in religious rituals, they were lifted in prayer. Hands were constantly seen, constantly performing gestures that told others something about the person to whom they belonged. For this reason, soft, pale hands became an important part of medieval beauty ideals. Smooth skin showed that you did not work with tools, grind flour, or till the soil. Calluses, stains, or scars revealed labor, and thus a lower station in life. A noblewoman's hands were supposed to look untouched, almost fragile, as if they had never carried a burden heavier than a rosary or a jeweled goblet. This appearance of fragility, far from being a flaw, was celebrated as the mark of true refinement. The pursuit of soft hands led to many practices meant to preserve their delicate appearance. Women of wealth used balms and ointments made from natural ingredients such as honey, almond oil, or rose water to moisturize the skin. Honey was thought to soften roughness, while almond oil provided a protective layer against dryness. Rose water, with its fragrance and soothing qualities, was used widely, not only for the face but for hands as well. Baths for the hands were sometimes prepared with warm milk or mixtures of herbs designed to keep the skin supple. In some households, servants were tasked with preparing these remedies, ensuring that the lady of the house could keep her hands in perfect condition. For noblewomen, hands were almost as carefully maintained as hair or face. Even nails were shaped and cleaned with care, though the tools were simple compared to modern ones. Nails were kept short and tidy, with attention to smoothness rather than decoration. Jewelry, rings, bracelets, and jeweled cuffs further highlighted the beauty of the hands, drawing the eye to their elegance. There were also cultural associations with hands that went beyond physical beauty. Hands were linked with symbolism and meaning in both secular and religious contexts. In art, saints were often depicted with delicate, glowing hands lifted in blessing or folded in prayer. A Saint A.S. hands looked soft not because they were pampered, but because they reflected purity and holiness. In literature, lovers praised each other's hands, describing them as white as lilies or as soft as silk. A kiss on the hand was not only a gesture of respect but also an acknowledgement of the hand's symbolic beauty. As with so many ideals, the beauty of soft hands also reinforced class distinctions. Peasants and artisans could never hope to maintain such hands, since their lives required constant work. Their hands bore the marks of their labor: roughness, sun-darkening, cuts, and stains. These visible signs told others immediately what class they belonged to. In contrast, the lady with smooth, pale hands signaled wealth and nobility without a word. Her hands were proof of a life removed from toil, a life defined by elegance and refinement. At the same time, there was a tension between admiration and suspicion. Just as with painted lips or carefully plucked brows, there were critics who warned against vanity. Religious voices sometimes reminded women that hands were meant for prayer, charity, and useful work, not only for decoration. A woman who obsessed over the softness of her hands might be accused of caring more about appearance than virtue. Yet, even within these warnings, the cultural admiration for delicate hands persisted. Beauty and morality were always in a kind of dance, never fully separated. Daily life gave many chances for hands to be noticed. At feasts, when food was eaten with fingers more often than utensils, hands were on display constantly. This made their cleanliness and appearance even more important. A noblewoman with soft, carefully washed hands stood out at the table. At dances, when hands were extended to a partner, their smoothness and delicacy could be felt as well as seen. During greetings, when a knight or nobleman kissed a lady's hand, the gesture carried not just respect but also recognition of its beauty. Stories and romances often wove hands into their imagery. Lovers might exchange tokens such as rings, which drew attention to the hands that wore them. In some tales, a knight described his lady's hand as the most precious part of her, praising its whiteness, softness, or slender shape. Such descriptions reflected real cultural values. A beautiful hand was as important as a fair face or golden hair in the imagination of the time. To keep hands soft, women often avoided certain tasks entirely. Sewing or embroidery was acceptable, since it did not create rough calluses, and in fact it was seen as a refined skill. But grinding grain, washing laundry, or chopping wood were duties passed to servants. Hands were to be preserved, not worn down. Their preservation was not just a matter of comfort, but of identity. To show hands without scars or stains was to show who you were in society. If we imagine a medieval hall filled with nobles at a feast, we can picture the sight of dozens of pale, delicate hands lifting cups, gesturing in conversation, or playing gently with strings of pearls. Candlelight glints off rings and bracelets, highlighting smooth fingers and carefully maintained nails. Among the sounds of music and laughter, hands are constantly moving, constantly visible, each gesture reinforcing the ideal of beauty they represent. In that environment, hands were not overlooked. They were part of the performance of nobility. Looking back, it may seem unusual to focus so much on hands, but it reminds us that every part of the body can be drawn into cultural ideals of beauty. In the Middle Ages, hands told a story of privilege, refinement, and even moral character. They were praised in poems, admired in paintings, and carefully tended in private chambers. To have soft, pale hands with no calluses was to announce silently, "I do not labor, I am set apart. I belong to the world of elegance." The beauty of hands was not only skin-deep. It was tied to the values of an entire society, where appearance was constantly read as a sign of inner worth, social rank, and moral standing. And so, for centuries, medieval women and men cared for their hands, washing, softening, and protecting them, making sure they told the right story in every gesture and every touch. In medieval Europe, the idea of beauty was made up of many small details, and one that often stood out was the admiration for white teeth. Today, we take for granted the idea that clean, bright teeth are desirable, but in the Middle Ages, this quality was rare and difficult to maintain. A mouth full of white teeth was not only a sign of beauty but also of youth, health, and wealth. Because few people had access to good dental care, those who managed to preserve their teeth in good condition stood out as unusually fortunate or unusually refined. Teeth were always visible in moments of laughter, speech, or song, and so they became part of how people judged appearance. In literature of the time, poets often praised a lady's smile, describing teeth as white as pearls, as small as seeds of ivory, or as shining like stars. These comparisons might sound poetic, but they reflected a real ideal: teeth that were even, clean, and pale. Such a smile was rare enough that it could seem almost magical, and when poets or troubadours wanted to praise a woman's beauty, they often included her teeth in their descriptions. But keeping teeth white was not an easy task in a world without modern toothpaste or dentistry. Diets were rough on the mouth. Bread, for example, was a staple food, but the flour was often ground with stones that left tiny bits of grit in it. Eating this over time wore down enamel. Meat was eaten when available, but it was often tough and required hard chewing. Sugar was rare and expensive, but honey and fruits could still stick to the teeth. Without regular cleaning, discoloration, decay, and loss of teeth were common. This is why white teeth became so prized. They were unusual, and they suggested either youth, luck, or extraordinary care. There were ways that people tried to preserve or improve the appearance of their teeth. Herbal remedies were popular. Mixtures of salt and sage were rubbed on the teeth to clean them, while crushed mint leaves or fennel seeds were chewed to freshen the breath. Some recipes called for rubbing teeth with powdered charcoal, which acted as an abrasive to scrub away stains. Vinegar was sometimes used as a rinse, though it could also wear down enamel over time. Wealthier households sometimes imported exotic ingredients, such as cloves or cinnamon, which were not only fragrant but also thought to keep the mouth clean and attractive. Even so, it was impossible to avoid the fact that many people had discolored or missing teeth. This made white teeth even more remarkable when they were seen. A noblewoman with a mouth full of pale, clean teeth would draw notice at once, since she contrasted so strongly with the majority. Her smile became one of her greatest charms, and it was remembered in songs and stories. Smiling itself, in fact, became a gesture tied to beauty and refinement, because it revealed what others could not easily hide. White teeth were not only a sign of beauty, they were also a sign of youth. Children and young adults naturally had whiter, fresher teeth, while age brought wear, staining, and loss. A bright smile suggested vitality, fertility, and health. In societies where lifespans were shorter and illness more common, these qualities carried deep meaning. To see someone with shining teeth was to see someone who seemed full of life and promise. For this reason, poets sometimes described their beloved's teeth in connection with springtime or flowers, emphasizing not just their beauty, but their freshness. As with many other beauty ideals, white teeth also reflected social class. People who labored physically and had rough diets suffered more damage to their teeth, while wealthier people had a better chance of preserving them. Nobles could afford softer, finer bread and better prepared food. They had access to herbs and imported spices for cleaning. They could even spare the time to rub their teeth with mixtures or rinse their mouths after meals. Though not guaranteed, wealth at least improved the chances of having healthier teeth, and with that came the possibility of keeping them whiter for longer. The admiration for white teeth also extended into courtly romance. In stories of knights and ladies, the hero often noticed the lady's smile, which was described as radiant and filled with shining teeth. This detail helped mark her as special, distinguished from others by her beauty. In some cases, her smile was described as so bright that it could light up a room or pierce a knight as heart. These exaggerated praises reveal just how powerful the image of white teeth was in the medieval imagination. At the same time, there was also suspicion of too much artifice. Just as with painted lips, people were wary of tricks or disguises. A woman who tried too obviously to whiten her teeth with strange powders might be accused of vanity or deceit. The ideal was that beauty should appear natural, even if it required effort behind the scenes. Subtle care was acceptable, but obvious painting or covering was not. Thus, white teeth were most admired when they seemed effortless, a gift of youth or nature, rather than the result of visible labor. We can imagine the social power of this feature in a medieval court. At a feast, laughter and conversation filled the hall, and noblewomen raised their cups, spoke to one another, or smiled politely at guests. Amid the dim light of torches and candles, a glimpse of white teeth would stand out immediately. It was like a flash of brightness, drawing eyes and admiration. In an age when pale skin, high foreheads, and delicate hands already formed part of the standard of beauty, a bright smile completed the picture. It was the final touch that suggested not only refinement, but also vitality and joy. Religious art sometimes echoed this admiration in subtle ways. Saints were rarely depicted smiling, since holiness was associated with seriousness and humility. But when they were shown with open mouths, perhaps in singing or prayer, their teeth were painted pale, even shining. This reflected the same association of whiteness with purity and goodness. Just as pale skin was linked to innocence, white teeth were tied to virtue and health. Of course, the reality of dental care meant that many people did not meet this ideal. Missing teeth, foul breath, and decay were common problems across all classes. This made the admiration for white teeth partly aspirational, an image of beauty that most people could not fully achieve. Yet the power of the ideal persisted, shaping the way people wrote about beauty, painted it, and dreamed about it. Looking back now, the medieval desire for white teeth reminds us once again that beauty has always been tied to rarity. What was hard to obtain became more valuable. In an age when most people could not preserve their teeth, the few who did were celebrated for it. Their smiles were remembered in poems, songs, and art, immortalized as signs of elegance and refinement. And so, in the candlelit halls of medieval Europe, white teeth shone like tiny jewels in the faces of those fortunate enough to possess them. They carried meanings of youth, health, wealth, and virtue, turning something as simple as a smile into one of the most admired and powerful features of all. In the Middle Ages, beauty was never only about the body itself. It was also about the ways people chose to decorate and frame that body, and few things carried more symbolic and aesthetic power than jewelry. Rings, necklaces, brooches, and jeweled headpieces were not just accessories. They were statements of wealth, refinement, and taste. They enhanced features, drew the eye to certain parts of the body, and transformed an already beautiful appearance into something unforgettable. Jewelry in medieval Europe was both practical and symbolic, a bridge between fashion and meaning, and it played a vital role in the construction of beauty ideals. To understand the impact of jewelry, we must imagine how dimly lit most medieval spaces were. Banquets, halls, and even churches glowed with torchlight, candlelight, or oil lamps. In such settings, polished surfaces and sparkling gems stood out dramatically. A necklace of pearls around a pale throat, or a jeweled brooch pinned at the chest, would catch the light and draw attention immediately. The shimmer of gold and the glint of stones were not simply decorations. They were signals, subtle messages about who a person was and where they stood in the social hierarchy. Necklaces were among the most important forms of jewelry for women, particularly because they framed the face. A chain of gold or a strand of pearls rested close to the skin, accentuating the neck and drawing the eye upward toward the mouth and eyes. Pearls, in particular, were highly prized because they symbolized purity and innocence. When a lady appeared with pearls against her pale skin, she embodied an ideal of virtue as well as beauty. Colored gemstones, such as rubies or sapphires, added depth and richness, each color carrying its own symbolism. Rubies suggested passion and vitality. Sapphires symbolized faith and loyalty, and emeralds hinted at fertility and renewal. Each stone was a conversation in itself, telling those who looked upon it something about the wearer's qualities or aspirations. Brooches were another favorite, often large and ornate, designed to secure the layers of heavy medieval gowns. But they were far more than fasteners. A brooch placed at the chest or shoulder drew attention to the upper body, highlighting the narrowness of the waist or the elegance of the neckline. The designs could be intricate, with engraved patterns, filigree, or enameled colors. Many brooches carried religious imagery, such as crosses or saints, blending fashion with devotion. To wear such a piece was to show both beauty and piety, a powerful combination in a society where religion shaped daily life. Rings also played a significant role, not just as symbols of marriage or alliances, but as markers of refinement. A hand already admired for its smoothness and delicacy became even more striking when adorned with rings of gold, silver, or set with stones. Each gesture, whether lifting a cup or turning the pages of a book, was emphasized by the sparkle on the fingers. Rings were often exchanged as tokens of love or loyalty, carrying deep emotional meaning. A knight might wear his lady's ring as a sign of devotion, while a woman might cherish a ring given to her as a promise or a memory. Head jewelry added another layer of beauty. Circlets, coronets, or jeweled hairnets framed the face and emphasized the high forehead so admired in that era. A thin band of gold across the brow, studded with gems, could turn a simple face into one that looked regal. Hair, already valued as a symbol of beauty, became a canvas for decoration. Pearls and beads were woven into braids, while fine nets glittered with tiny gems, catching the light with every movement. The effect was not only beautiful, but also symbolic. A crowned head, even with the simplest of bands, suggested dignity and power. Men, too, used jewelry to enhance their appearance. Though less elaborate than women's, men's adornments carried strong messages of status. A heavy chain of gold around the neck, a signet ring on the hand, or a jewel on a cloak clasp signaled wealth, strength, and authority. A knight might wear a jewel-encrusted belt, both functional and decorative, emphasizing his waist and symbolizing his martial power. In courts and gatherings, men's jewelry was not only tolerated but admired, especially when it reflected their family heritage or rank. The materials of jewelry mattered deeply. Gold was the most prized, not only for its luster but also for its durability and symbolism of eternal worth. Silver was admired for its cool brightness, especially when set with dark stones that contrasted beautifully against it. Gemstones carried meanings that were widely understood. Pearls for purity, rubies for passion, emeralds for fertility, sapphires for loyalty, and diamonds, though rare, for strength and invincibility. To wear a certain stone was not just to adorn oneself, but to project certain qualities. The connection between jewelry and beauty was reinforced in literature and art. In romances, heroines were often described not only by their natural features, but by the jewels they wore. A lady's necklace might be praised in a poem as if it were inseparable from her beauty, shining with her own radiance. In illuminated manuscripts, noble figures were depicted with golden chains, jeweled crowns, and rings, each detail carefully painted to convey refinement and power. These artistic choices shaped how people understood beauty, making jewelry a natural part of it. At the same time, there was always a tension between admiration and caution. The Church sometimes warned against excessive adornment, criticizing jewelry as a sign of vanity or pride. Sermons reminded women that inner virtue mattered more than outer decoration. Yet even within such warnings, jewelry retained its place. A jewel might be excused if it carried religious meaning, such as a cross or relic, or if it symbolized family honor. And for most nobles, the practical value of jewelry as a marker of wealth and status outweighed the criticisms. In daily life, jewelry also had practical functions in enhancing beauty. A brooch could hold a cloak just so, arranging fabric to flatter the body. A belt with a jeweled buckle could emphasize the waist, creating the illusion of greater slenderness. Earrings, though less common in some regions, could draw attention to the shape of the face and neck. Each piece was carefully chosen and carefully placed, with an eye for how it would change the way the body was seen. Imagine a medieval feast hall, filled with music and flickering candlelight. Guests laugh, dance, and talk, their movements catching the light. Around the tables sit noblewomen, their gowns heavy with fabric but lightened by the sparkle of jewelry. Necklaces gleam, brooches glitter, rings flash as cups are lifted. The jewels frame the beauty of the women and men alike, turning ordinary gestures into moments of admiration. In that dim hall, the light plays not only on faces but on gems, making beauty something that glows and shines. Looking back, jewelry in the Middle Ages shows us how beauty was a collaboration between nature and art. Natural features, pale skin, golden hair, delicate hands, were celebrated, but they were framed, highlighted, and enhanced by the careful use of jewels. Beauty was not left to chance. It was shaped and adorned until it matched the ideals of the time. A simple face could become radiant with the right necklace, and an already admired hand could become unforgettable with the right ring. And so, in the culture of medieval Europe, jewelry was never merely decoration. It was a language, a symbol, and an essential part of beauty. It told the world who you were, what you valued, and how you wished to be seen. And under the candlelight of castles and courts, it turned every movement into a shimmer, every glance into a spark, and every gesture into a story of elegance and refinement. In medieval Europe, beauty was not only about how someone looked, but also about how they carried themselves in sound, movement, and even scent. Among the more delicate and sometimes overlooked aspects of beauty was the role of perfume. Today, perfume is common, a product bought in bottles and worn daily, but in the Middle Ages it was something rarer, more precious, and deeply symbolic. Scents were tied to both physical attractiveness and spiritual purity, and a person's fragrance could be as powerful a marker of refinement as pale skin, golden hair, or fine jewelry. Perfume in the medieval world was not made in laboratories or bottled in glass flacons, but created from natural ingredients: flowers, herbs, resins, and oils. Roses, lavender, and violets were among the most popular flowers used in perfumed oils, while rosemary, sage, and thyme added herbal freshness. Exotic ingredients such as musk, ambergris, and frankincense, imported through long trade routes, were incredibly costly and reserved for the wealthy. To wear these rare scents was to announce your status as clearly as if you had draped yourself in jewels. A whiff of musk or amber in a noble hall told others that the person wearing it was connected to distant lands and rare treasures. The use of perfume also tied closely into medieval ideas about health. At the time, people believed in the miasma theory, the idea that bad air spread illness. Sweet scents were thought not only to please the senses but also to protect the body. A noblewoman who perfumed herself with rose water might believe she was warding off disease, as well as making herself more pleasant to be around. Perfumed pouches filled with herbs and spices were sometimes worn around the neck or tied to the waist, their fragrance drifting gently as the wearer walked. These were not only charms against illness but subtle ways of projecting refinement and care. The ritual of using perfume could also be part of a beauty routine. Wealthy women bathed their hands and faces with rosewater or lavender water, both to cleanse and to leave a lingering fragrance. Hair might be rinsed with herbal infusions that left behind gentle scents, making a lady's presence felt even when she was across a room. Gowns, too, could be perfumed. Clothes were sometimes stored with sachets of dried flowers or even lightly sprinkled with scented waters before being worn. When a woman entered a hall and her gown carried the scent of roses or violets, it added an invisible layer of allure to her appearance. Perfume was also connected with love and romance. Troubadour poetry often mentioned the fragrance of a lady as part of her beauty, describing her as smelling of flowers or spring breezes. A knight might remember the scent of his beloved as strongly as her face or her voice. In some tales, the presence of perfume was a sign of enchantment, making a lady seem otherworldly, like a fairy or a saint. To smell sweet was to embody not just physical beauty, but also a kind of spiritual or magical charm. The Church's relationship with perfume was complicated. On the one hand, incense and sweet-smelling oils were used in religious rituals, and fragrance was associated with holiness. The scent of frankincense rising in a cathedral was meant to symbolize prayers rising to heaven. Saints were sometimes described as having bodies that emitted sweet scents even after death, a sign of divine favor. But on the other hand, excessive use of perfume for personal vanity could be criticized. A woman who drenched herself in strong scents might be accused of pride or seduction. As with painted lips or ornate jewelry, the balance was delicate, enough to suggest refinement, not so much that it invited suspicion. Perfume also marked class distinctions clearly. For peasants and laborers, the scents of daily life were earthy and rough: sweat, soil, smoke from the hearth. To smell of roses or musk was almost impossible outside of noble households. Wealth allowed access not only to rare ingredients but also to the leisure needed to maintain perfumed baths, scented clothes, and delicate sachets. Smell itself became a signal of privilege. Just as pale skin told others you did not labor in the sun, a body that carried the fragrance of flowers or spices told them you lived a life of refinement, far removed from the odors of work and hardship. Imagine a medieval feast hall, filled with music and flickering candlelight. Among the scents of roasted meats, spiced wine, and burning torches, a noblewoman passes by, leaving behind the faint trace of rose or lavender. The fragrance cuts through the heavier smells, delicate and unexpected, like a secret whisper. Those around her might not only admire her beauty, but also remember her by that fragrance, a mark of distinction in an otherwise crowded hall. Perfume, in such moments, became part of memory itself. Perfume also played a role in intimacy. In private chambers, a lady might anoint herself with scented oils before a meeting with her husband or lover. The fragrance made the encounter feel special, elevated above the ordinary. A knight might remember not only the touch or voice of his beloved, but also the scent that surrounded her. In this way, perfume became part of the language of affection, adding an invisible layer to the experience of love. At times, perfumes were even used to mark special occasions. Weddings might involve perfumed garments, bridal chambers filled with flowers, or gifts of scented oils. Religious festivals used incense to transform ordinary spaces into places that felt holy and grand. Perfume was always more than a smell. It was a symbol of transformation, of turning the everyday into the extraordinary. There were dangers, of course. Some recipes for perfumes or scented powders used ingredients that could be harsh or even harmful. Certain resins or oils could irritate the skin, and without knowledge of chemistry, people sometimes experimented with mixtures that were unpleasant or unsafe. But just as women risked irritation by plucking brows or whitening their skin with powders, they accepted these risks for the sake of beauty. Looking back now, the role of perfume in medieval Europe shows how beauty was about all the senses, not just sight. The perfect lady or nobleman was not only fair to look upon but also graceful in movement, gentle in speech, and pleasing in fragrance. To be surrounded by sweet scents was to complete the image of refinement, creating an aura that lingered in the memory of all who encountered it. In the end, perfume in the Middle Ages was more than a luxury. It was a statement, a marker of wealth, a tool of attraction, and a link between the earthly and the divine. In noble courts and dimly lit halls, perfume floated unseen but powerfully felt, reminding everyone that beauty was not only what you could see, but also what you could sense in the air around you. In medieval Europe, beauty was never a single, fixed image. It shifted with time, place, and culture, and nowhere is this clearer than in the ideals of body size. At different points in the Middle Ages, people admired women who were soft and plump, while in other times and circles, slim figures were seen as the height of elegance. These shifting ideals reveal much about how people connected appearance with health, wealth, and social identity. A body was not just a body. It was a symbol, a message, and a reflection of the values of the world around it. For much of the Middle Ages, plumpness was considered beautiful. This was not the kind of extreme obesity we think of today, but rather a soft, rounded form that suggested comfort and abundance. A woman with gentle curves, fuller cheeks, and a body that looked well-fed was admired because she seemed healthy and prosperous. In a world where food scarcity was common, to have extra weight meant you were not struggling. It meant you had access to plentiful meals, servants to prepare them, and the leisure to enjoy them. In short, plumpness was tied to wealth and privilege. Artists captured this ideal in paintings and manuscripts. Noblewomen were often shown with soft faces, rounded hands, and bodies that filled out their gowns. Their beauty was described in terms of ripeness, like fruit ready to be enjoyed. Poets compared their cheeks to apples or their bodies to blossoms. The image of softness was linked with warmth, fertility, and nurturing, qualities admired in wives and mothers. To be plump was not only fashionable but also a sign of vitality and readiness for motherhood, something society valued greatly. Yet this was not the only ideal. In some contexts, especially in later medieval courts, a slimmer figure became fashionable. This shift was connected to elegance and refinement. A slender waist, narrow shoulders, and long, thin arms were seen as graceful and aristocratic. To appear slim suggested discipline, restraint, and control. Just as a tightly laced bodice shaped the waist, a lean figure shaped the impression of composure. In art, this can be seen in images of courtly ladies who look almost delicate, their bodies elongated and their movements light. Why did the ideal shift between plump and slim? Part of the reason lay in changing values and circumstances. In times of plenty, when food was abundant, plumpness was admired as a natural outcome of wealth. But in times of famine or hardship, when even nobles risked scarcity, the ability to appear slim yet healthy might symbolize self-control and spiritual purity. Religion also influenced these views. The Church praised moderation and warned against gluttony. A body that was too round could be seen as a sign of indulgence, while a slim body suggested piety and restraint. Thus, the balance between plump and slim was never only about looks, it was about morality as well. There was also a gendered difference in how these ideals were applied. For women, plumpness often symbolized fertility and warmth, while slimness suggested delicacy and refinement. For men, plumpness could sometimes be ridiculed, especially among knights where strength and agility were valued. A broad, muscular figure was admired for men, while too much softness might be seen as weakness. This contrast shows how the same body shape could be praised or criticized differently depending on gender and social role. Fashion, of course, played a role in shaping how bodies were perceived. Gowns with flowing fabric could make a woman's figure seem fuller, while tightly laced bodices emphasized narrow waists. Belts, sashes, and tailored sleeves all worked to highlight or conceal certain shapes. A gown with wide skirts made hips seem larger, while long, vertical lines in fabric created the impression of height and slimness. In this way, clothing worked hand in hand with body ideals, reinforcing whichever form was fashionable at the time. One striking thing about medieval beauty standards is that they rarely praised extremes. Whether plump or slim, the admired body was usually moderate. A woman should not be so plump that she looked unhealthy, nor so slim that she seemed starved. Balance was key. Too much in either direction risked ridicule or suspicion. A woman too round might be accused of greed, while one too thin might be thought sickly or poor. The admired form was always one that seemed to represent health, vitality, and social grace. We can imagine the effect of these ideals in a medieval hall. A noblewoman enters, her gown flowing, her figure shaped by layers of fabric and careful lacing. If she is plump, her soft cheeks glow in the candlelight, and her rounded body fills her gown with dignity. Guests might whisper that she looks healthy, strong, and blessed with abundance. If she is slim, her movements are light and delicate, her waist narrow beneath her belt, her body graceful as she glides across the room. Others might admire her discipline, her elegance, her air of composure. Both forms could be admired, depending on the context, but each carried its own message about who she was and what she represented. Artistic representations highlight these shifting preferences. In earlier medieval manuscripts, figures often appear fuller, with rounded bodies and faces that reflect abundance. In later Gothic art, figures become more elongated, their limbs thinner, their bodies almost ethereal. This change mirrors not only artistic style but also changing beauty ideals. Where earlier times celebrated earthly abundance, later times leaned toward spiritual refinement. Poetry, too, reflects these contrasts. Some poets praised women with soft arms and ripe cheeks, celebrating warmth and fertility. Others praised women as slender as a reed, or delicate as a flower, celebrating fragility and grace. Both images existed side by side, showing that beauty was never one thing in the Middle Ages. It was a spectrum, shifting with mood, time, and place. What unites both ideals, plump and slim, is the way they reflected social values. Neither was about personal preference alone. Both were symbols, ways of reading the body as a sign of wealth, health, morality, and refinement. The body was not just flesh. It was a message, shaped and interpreted by the eyes of others. Looking back today, it is easy to see echoes of these shifting ideals in our own world. Just as medieval people praised plumpness or slimness depending on their values, modern societies also shift between body ideals. At times, curves are celebrated. At other times, slenderness is praised. What remains constant is the way beauty ideals reveal deeper truths about society, its fears, its desires, its sense of what health and morality look like. In the Middle Ages, whether admired for softness or slenderness, the body was always part of a larger story. A woman's form was praised not just for itself but for what it symbolized: abundance, fertility, refinement, or restraint. To be plump was to show wealth and warmth. To be slim was to show elegance and discipline. Both could be admired, but always within the delicate balance of the society that surrounded them. And so the shifting ideal of body size reminds us that beauty is never fixed. It bends and changes with time, always reflecting what a culture values most. In medieval Europe, the body became a mirror of society's hopes and fears, carrying meanings that went far beyond the surface. Whether soft and plump or slim and delicate, the admired body was never just about appearance. It was about identity, virtue, and the endless human desire to embody beauty in whatever form the age demanded. In medieval Europe, a face was a canvas on which health, beauty, and even moral character were judged. Among the many features that people admired, rosy cheeks stood out as one of the clearest signs of youth and vitality. To have a natural flush was to show the world that you were alive, healthy, and full of energy. It was a detail that poets praised, painters highlighted, and lovers remembered. Rosy cheeks seemed to capture everything that was desirable in a person: freshness, warmth, and the promise of life. The importance of rosy cheeks made sense in a world where illness was constant and often visible. Pale or sickly faces were associated with weakness, poverty, or disease. To have a natural blush was to stand apart from that, to show the glow of health. A touch of color on the face suggested good circulation, strength, and a body filled with vitality. In women, it was also linked to fertility, a sign that they were strong enough to carry children. For men, it suggested vigor and readiness for physical challenges. A rosy cheek was not just attractive, it was reassuring. Literature of the time is filled with praise for this feature. Poets compared a beloved's cheeks to roses, apples, or blossoms. Troubadour songs often lingered on the image of cheeks like fresh roses in the snow, a phrase that combined the admired paleness of skin with the desired flush of health. The contrast of white and red, the pale canvas of the skin with the sudden bloom of pink, was considered the perfect balance. It represented both innocence and vitality, modesty and warmth. Artists, too, painted this ideal. In illuminated manuscripts and later panel paintings, faces were often depicted with subtle patches of red or pink on the cheeks. This was not only to make them look more lifelike, but to reflect the beauty ideals of the time. Saints, noblewomen, and even young men were shown with gentle blushes that suggested health and purity. In religious art, the rosiness of a saint's face could symbolize divine favor, as if their health and beauty came from inner holiness as much as from the body. Achieving this ideal naturally was not always easy. Life in medieval Europe could be harsh. Poor diets, limited medical knowledge, and hard labor often left faces looking pale, sallow, or worn. For this reason, many turned to small tricks to enhance their cheeks. Just as women might use berries or herbs to color their lips, they sometimes applied tints to their cheeks. Crushed berries, beet juice, or wine dabs could create a temporary flush. Rose petals mixed with oils might also be applied for a faint blush. These methods were subtle, and subtlety mattered. To look as if one had painted one's face too obviously was risky, inviting accusations of vanity or deceit. The admired blush was one that seemed natural, even if it was helped along by art. There were also simple, practical tricks. Women were known to pinch their cheeks slightly before entering a hall or gathering, bringing blood to the surface for a temporary rosy glow. Others might take brisk walks in cool air since the chill could create the desired flush. Even drinking wine was believed to add warmth to the face, though too much brought the opposite effect and was frowned upon. The goal was always moderation, a soft bloom of color rather than anything too bold. The symbolism of rosy cheeks extended beyond health. They were also linked to emotions. A blush could signal modesty, innocence, or the excitement of love. In romances and tales, the moment when a lady blushed was often described in detail, marking it as a sign of purity and sincerity. A red flush spreading across the face showed vulnerability, honesty, and emotional depth. To blush was not only to look beautiful, but to reveal an inner truth. Thus, rosy cheeks became both an aesthetic and a moral quality. As with many beauty ideals, class played a role. Nobles had more chances to maintain rosy complexions because they could eat better diets, avoid exhausting labor, and spend time in controlled environments. Their skin was not weather-beaten like that of peasants, and so when they displayed rosy cheeks, it seemed like a natural bloom on otherwise pale, protected skin. The contrast again highlighted social differences. Pale skin marked nobility, and the addition of a soft blush made it seem both healthy and refined. Rosy cheeks also played into the larger theme of balance in medieval beauty. Too pale, and one risked looking sickly. Too red, and one risked looking coarse, drunken, or common. The ideal was the middle ground, a pale face with just the right touch of rose. This balance echoed broader medieval ideas of harmony, moderation, and proportion. Beauty was not about extremes, but about the perfect blending of opposites. We can picture the effect of this ideal in a medieval gathering. In a hall lit by torches, a noblewoman enters, her skin pale and smooth, her cheeks touched with a soft pink glow. Her presence is noticed immediately, not only because of her gown or jewels, but because of that healthy bloom in her face. She looks alive, youthful, and full of grace. Conversations pause, glances linger, and poets are inspired. Her cheeks tell a story that words cannot. She is healthy, virtuous, and desirable. For men, rosy cheeks carried different but related meanings. A young knight with flushed cheeks might be praised for his vigor and energy, while an older man with pale, drawn skin might be pitied for his loss of strength. Rosiness in men suggested readiness for action, courage, and the fire of youth. This, too, appears in poetry, where heroes are described as having faces glowing with health, their cheeks brightened by the heat of battle or the excitement of love. The religious aspect cannot be overlooked. The Church often warned against excessive painting of the face, but even religious writers praised the natural blush as a sign of inner purity. Saints were sometimes described as having faces that glowed with spiritual health, their cheeks radiant with holy fire. The connection between physical rosiness and moral beauty shows how deeply intertwined the ideals were. A blush could mean innocence, but it could also mean divine favor. Looking back now, the medieval love of rosy cheeks reveals the way small details could carry enormous cultural weight. A simple flush of color was never just about appearance. It was about health, youth, morality, class, and even divine blessing. It was a sign that someone embodied the balance that medieval society admired, pale enough to show nobility, yet rosy enough to show life. And so, in poems, paintings, and whispered stories, rosy cheeks became a symbol of beauty that lasted through the centuries. They told the world that the person before you was full of health, virtue, and warmth. They were more than a color on the face. They were the bloom of life itself, admired and remembered long after the glow had faded. In medieval Europe, smooth skin was one of the clearest markers of beauty, and just like pale complexions or rosy cheeks, it carried more meaning than appearance alone. To have clear, unblemished skin suggested health, youth, and refinement. It told the world that you were not burdened by illness or harsh labor, and it gave the impression of purity and innocence. Smooth skin became an ideal that men and women alike admired, but achieving it in an age without modern skincare was a daily challenge. The fascination with smooth skin was rooted in cultural ideas about order and harmony. Medieval people often believed that the body reflected the soul, so a face free of blemishes was read as a sign of inner virtue. By contrast, scars, pimples, or poxmarks could be interpreted as evidence of sin, impurity, or even divine punishment. This was especially true during outbreaks of diseases like smallpox or the plague, which often left permanent marks on the skin. Smoothness was therefore more than a matter of beauty. It was a sign of divine favor, a body untouched by visible flaws. Writers and poets often praised the smoothness of skin when describing beauty. They compared it to polished ivory, fresh milk, or the surface of marble. These comparisons emphasized both purity and perfection. A noblewoman's hands might be described as smooth as silk, or her cheeks as clear as glass. Such imagery reinforced the idea that smooth skin was an essential part of the admired appearance, something that defined elegance and nobility. Maintaining smooth skin, however, required effort. Medieval people used a variety of remedies and practices to preserve or improve their complexions. Herbal ointments were common, made from ingredients like honey, aloe, or chamomile. Honey, in particular, was prized for its soothing and healing properties, believed to soften skin and reduce irritation. Rosewater was used to cleanse and refresh, while mixtures of milk and ground almonds were applied as simple face masks. These treatments were often passed down through households, taught from mothers to daughters, and preserved in recipe books for noble families. There were also more unusual remedies. Some recipes suggested rubbing the skin with bread soaked in wine or applying egg whites to tighten the complexion. Wealthier women sometimes imported powders made of crushed pearls or exotic minerals, believing they would smooth and brighten the face. Though not all of these methods were effective, the effort behind them shows how highly smooth skin was valued. People were willing to experiment, risk discomfort, and spend money to achieve the ideal. The Church, as with many aspects of beauty, had a complicated stance on skin treatments. On the one hand, caring for the body was not condemned. Cleanliness and health were praised, and saints were sometimes described as having radiant, glowing faces that reflected their holiness. On the other hand, the use of cosmetics to cover or disguise blemishes was often criticized as vanity or deceit. A woman who painted over her imperfections too heavily risked being accused of pride or trickery. The balance, once again, lay in moderation. Subtle care for the skin was acceptable, but obvious efforts to conceal flaws could bring suspicion. Smooth skin also carried clear social implications. Nobles were more likely to maintain unblemished appearances because they were spared the hardest physical labor. Peasants working in fields developed rougher skin, sunburn, and marks from outdoor life. Their hands and faces bore the traces of toil, while nobles could protect themselves indoors, wear veils or hats against the sun, and use scented ointments prepared by servants. The smoothness of skin therefore became another visible marker of class. To look upon someone with clear, soft skin was to recognize their status instantly. Men, too, were drawn into this ideal. Though women's beauty was more closely tied to smoothness, noblemen were expected to maintain a refined appearance as well. Knights and courtiers often shaved or trimmed carefully, keeping their faces free of rough stubble. Smooth skin suggested youth and discipline, while scars or blemishes could either elevate a man as a symbol of bravery or mark him as flawed, depending on the context. In poetry, young heroes were often described with fresh, clear faces, while older men bore the marks of time. Smoothness in men was admired, but it carried slightly different meanings, less about purity and more about vitality and refinement. There were also symbolic layers to the idea of blemishes. Spots or scars on the skin could be interpreted as signs of moral corruption or hidden flaws. Medieval medicine connected physical conditions with inner balance, believing that humors in the body determined health. An imbalance that caused blemishes might be seen as evidence of spiritual disorder as well. Thus, smooth skin symbolized more than health. It was a reflection of inner harmony and moral order. We can imagine the effect of this ideal in a medieval hall. A lady enters, her face pale and smooth, free of marks, glowing softly in the candlelight. She wears no heavy powders, only a hint of rose on her cheeks. Her skin seems untouched by sun or toil, and those who see her admire not just her beauty, but the life of refinement it represents. Her smooth complexion tells the story of her class, her care, and her alignment with the values of the time. But we can also imagine the opposite. A face scarred by illness or roughened by work might immediately set someone apart. Even if the person was kind or noble of spirit, society often judged them harshly based on appearance. This contrast highlights how unforgiving beauty ideals could be, and how much weight was placed on features people could not always control. Despite this, smooth skin was often described in gentle, almost magical terms. Lovers in poetry remembered the touch of soft hands, the glow of unmarked cheeks, the smoothness of a brow kissed in secret. Artists painted saints and nobles with flawless faces, their skin shining in the light of heaven or the glow of wealth. Smooth skin became a symbol of everything admired: youth, health, grace, and favor, both earthly and divine. Looking back now, the medieval obsession with smooth skin reminds us of the timelessness of certain beauty ideals. Even today, people spend enormous effort and money trying to achieve the same thing: a clear, unblemished face that signals health and youth. The methods have changed, but the desire is the same. In the Middle Ages, smooth skin was not simply vanity. It was a language that spoke of identity, class, morality, and even spirituality. To have it was to carry with you a kind of silent power, the ability to move through halls, courts, and gatherings admired not only for what you wore or said, but for what your very skin revealed. And in that quiet admiration, smoothness was never just about the surface. It was about everything the surface suggested beneath. In medieval Europe, facial features carried deep symbolic weight, and one of the most admired traits was a straight, well-proportioned nose. Today, we may not think much about the shape of a nose beyond personal preference, but in the Middle Ages, it was considered an important marker of beauty, nobility, and even moral character. A straight nose suggested harmony, order, and refinement, while crooked or flattened noses were sometimes associated with ugliness, roughness, or misfortune. The nose, sitting at the center of the face, framed everything else and acted almost like a signature of one's appearance. Writers and poets often included the nose when describing beauty. A noblewoman in courtly romance might be praised for her fair, straight nose, which was seen as a sign of balance in her features. For men, too, the straight nose was admired, as it suggested strength, dignity, and nobility. Medieval poets compared such noses to marble columns or smooth lines in architecture, tying the harmony of the body to the harmony of art and geometry. This reflects the medieval fascination with proportion. Faces and bodies were measured, at least in imagination, against ideals of symmetry and balance. The admiration for straight noses also came from classical influences. Medieval scholars studied texts from ancient Rome and Greece, where philosophers and artists had praised proportional features as marks of beauty and moral goodness. Statues of Roman emperors and Greek gods, many of which displayed straight, narrow noses, became models of perfection. These ideas filtered into medieval culture, where a straight nose became not just a feature, but a reflection of cultural ideals passed down through centuries. Social class played a large role in shaping this ideal. People believed that noble families, protected from the hardships of labor and enriched by generations of privilege, tended to have more refined features. A straight, narrow nose was seen as a sign of high birth, while broader or flatter noses were linked to peasants and workers. These associations were not based in reality, of course, but they reinforced class divisions. To look upon someone with a straight nose was to imagine they carried nobility in their blood. Artists emphasized this in their work. In illuminated manuscripts, saints and nobles were often painted with long, straight noses, reinforcing the connection between beauty, holiness, and refinement. Religious art depicted the Virgin Mary with an elegant, straight nose, symbolizing her perfection and purity. Christ himself was often painted in this way, his features refined and symmetrical, showing divinity through human form. By contrast, villains, demons, or grotesque figures in manuscripts were sometimes given hooked or crooked noses to emphasize their flaws. Thus, the shape of the nose became a shorthand in art for virtue or vice, beauty or ugliness. Maintaining or enhancing the appearance of the nose was more limited than with other features, since its shape could not easily be changed. Still, people paid attention to how it was framed. Hairstyles and headpieces were arranged to draw attention to the straightness of the nose. Women with high foreheads and veils framing their faces made their noses stand out even more, creating a clear, balanced line from forehead to chin. Men grew or shaved facial hair in ways that emphasized the strength or refinement of their noses, making the feature part of the overall impression of dignity. There was also a moral dimension. The straight nose was sometimes linked to inner balance and righteousness, while crooked noses were associated with dishonesty or corruption. This was not unique to the Middle Ages. Throughout history, people have read moral meaning into physical features, but medieval culture heightened the connection. A straight nose was a sign of order, and order was linked to both social and divine harmony. A face that appeared balanced was read as reflecting a balanced soul. In courtly culture, this admiration became part of flirtation and love poetry. A knight describing his beloved might linger on her eyes, lips, and nose, praising the harmony of her features as proof of her worthiness. The nose was not always the star of the description, but it was included as a necessary element of beauty. Without a straight nose, the balance of the face seemed incomplete. It was the quiet feature that held everything else together, the line that gave the face its sense of unity. We can imagine the effect of this in a medieval hall. A noblewoman steps into the candlelight, her veil framing her pale face. Her high forehead, smooth cheeks, and straight nose create a face that seems almost sculpted. Those who see her notice not only her gown and jewels, but the symmetry of her features, the harmony of her appearance. She embodies the ideals sung by poets and painted in manuscripts. In that moment, her straight nose is not just a feature. It is a signal that she belongs to the highest order of beauty and refinement. For men, the straight nose carried slightly different meanings. A knight or nobleman with such a nose might be praised for looking strong, disciplined, and commanding. Just as broad shoulders or a narrow waist suggested martial readiness, a straight nose suggested inner dignity and control. A crooked nose could be excused if it was the result of battle. Such scars could even be admired as signs of bravery. But in general, the straight nose remained the ideal, especially in settings where refinement and nobility were celebrated. Religious symbolism reinforced these ideas. The Virgin Mary, as mentioned, was often painted with a straight nose, showing perfection. Saints, too, shared this trait, their features free from imperfection, reflecting their holy lives. By contrast, sinful or grotesque figures were given bent or exaggerated noses, turning the body into a symbol of the soul. This artistic choice taught viewers that the shape of the nose was not random. It was a sign of beauty, morality, and even divine grace. Looking back now, it may seem strange that such attention was paid to the nose, a feature we often overlook. But in a culture that read meaning into every part of the body, the nose could not be ignored. It sat at the center of the face, uniting the eyes and mouth, shaping the first impression a person gave. A straight nose suggested nobility, health, and harmony, while deviations could mark someone as flawed or dangerous. Today, beauty standards have shifted, but echoes of the medieval admiration for straight noses remain. We still associate symmetry with beauty, still describe faces as well-proportioned. The medieval love of straight noses reminds us that every age has its own way of turning natural features into symbols of something larger: virtue, status, or identity. In the end, the beauty of straight noses in medieval Europe was never just about appearance. It was about the values a society projected onto the body. It was about nobility, harmony, and balance, about art and morality meeting in the lines of a face. And for those who lived in that world, a straight nose was not simply a feature. It was a promise of everything that beauty was meant to represent. In medieval Europe, eyes were often described as the windows of the soul, and few features were praised as much in poetry, song, and art as bright, clear eyes. To have eyes that shone with light, full of color and life, was considered one of the highest marks of beauty. A person's eyes revealed not only their appearance but also their character. They reflected emotions, health, and even spiritual qualities, making them one of the most powerful symbols of both inner and outer beauty. Writers of the time filled their verses with descriptions of eyes. Lovers were said to be captured by a single glance. Knights claimed they were struck down more powerfully by their lady's gaze than by any sword, and poets compared eyes to stars' jewels or the surface of a clear lake. The brightness of the eyes mattered more than the exact color, though certain shades carried their own meanings. Blue eyes were often linked to innocence, purity, and spiritual grace, while green eyes might be described as mysterious or enchanting. Dark eyes, deep brown or black, were said to show passion, wisdom, or hidden strength. But regardless of color, eyes that sparkled with clarity and light were admired as the truest mark of beauty. The emphasis on bright eyes made sense in a world where health was visible in the face. Dull, clouded, or reddened eyes might signal illness, fatigue, or sorrow. Clear, shining eyes suggested youth, energy, and vitality. A lady with bright eyes looked not only beautiful, but also healthy and desirable. In men, such eyes suggested vigor, courage, and readiness for action. Eyes were therefore not only attractive but also reassuring. They showed that a person was alive and strong. Artists reinforced these ideals in paintings and manuscripts. In illuminated miniatures, noble figures and saints were often given wide, bright eyes, painted with tiny highlights to suggest light within them. This gave the impression of purity, holiness, or intelligence. By contrast, villains, demons, or sinful characters were sometimes shown with squinting, shadowed, or strangely shaped eyes, marking them as morally corrupt. The eyes became one of the most important features for distinguishing beauty from ugliness, virtue from vice. In daily life, the brightness of eyes could not be controlled as easily as features like skin or hair. Still, people found ways to enhance them. Some medieval recipes recommended washing the eyes with herbal infusions, such as rosewater or fennel, believed to refresh and clear the gaze. Wealthy women might rest their eyes with cooling cloths soaked in herbs to prevent puffiness. Diet, too, played a role. Foods considered nourishing for the blood were thought to give eyes their sparkle, and while no one could change their natural color, the clarity and liveliness of the gaze could be encouraged through simple care. There was also a spiritual aspect to the admiration of bright eyes. The Church often connected light with divinity, and so eyes that seemed to shine were sometimes described as reflecting God's presence. Saints were said to have eyes filled with holy fire, their gaze capable of inspiring or even healing others. In romances, a lady's eyes might be described as enchanting or magical, capable of binding a knight's heart or leading him to noble deeds. To meet someone as bright eyes was not only to admire their beauty, but also to feel the weight of their soul. The power of eyes also came from their role in communication. In a society where open expressions of love could be risky, especially for women, the eyes carried unspoken messages. Lovers exchanged glances across halls, gardens, or churches, using their eyes to say what words could not. Poets described this silent language in detail, praising the way a single look could carry longing, encouragement, or rejection. Bright eyes were not only attractive, they were powerful tools in the subtle dance of courtship. Social class influenced perceptions here as well. Those of noble birth were more likely to have the leisure and health that contributed to bright eyes. Peasants, weary from labor, often had eyes reddened by smoke, sun, or fatigue. Nobles who spent more time indoors or in shaded courtyards could more easily maintain the clarity and brightness that was admired. Again, the body became a symbol of class, with the brightness of the eyes reflecting the refinement of one's life. We can picture the scene in a medieval court. Music plays, candles flicker, and nobles gather in conversation. A knight glances across the hall and meets the eyes of a lady. Her gaze is bright, catching the light, and in that moment he feels struck by something greater than words. Around her, others admire her gown, her hair, her jewels, but what they remember later is her eyes, the way they seemed to hold light, the way they suggested both beauty and depth. In that hall, her eyes were her most powerful adornment. Men, too, relied on their eyes to express strength and nobility. A knight praised for his courage might also be described as having eyes that shone with determination, or that blazed in battle. Leaders were often depicted with steady, clear gazes, their eyes reflecting wisdom and command. Just as a lady's bright eyes enchanted and inspired, a man's bright eyes reassured and led. In both cases, the brightness carried moral as well as physical meaning. Religious texts sometimes described heaven itself in terms of light for the eyes. To look upon God was to see brightness beyond measure, and saints in visions were said to have eyes filled with radiance. This connection deepened the cultural admiration for bright eyes. They were not simply attractive, they were a reflection of the divine order, a reminder that beauty was tied to light, clarity, and harmony. Looking back now, the medieval love of bright eyes shows us how beauty ideals often focus on what seems most alive. Hair could be styled, skin could be treated, but the eyes could not easily be faked. Their brightness was a natural gift, one that reflected health, emotion, and character all at once. That is why they were so deeply admired and so often described in poetry and art. Today, we still say that eyes are the windows of the soul, and we still admire brightness, clarity, and life in someone's gaze. The medieval fascination with bright eyes reminds us of how timeless this ideal is. Across centuries, people have looked into each other's eyes and found beauty, depth, and meaning there. In the Middle Ages, to have bright eyes was to carry light within you, a light that others could see and feel. It was a mark of beauty that surpassed jewels, gowns, or even the finest features. It was the gaze that lingered in memory, the glance that captured hearts, and the light that symbolized everything people admired most. Clothing in medieval Europe was far more than protection from the weather or a way to display wealth. It was also a tool for shaping the body and guiding how beauty was seen. The gowns, tunics, belts, and layers of fabric were carefully chosen and arranged to emphasize or conceal certain features. People in the Middle Ages understood that clothing could transform how a body looked, and so it became a powerful part of beauty ideals. The shape of the body was never judged on its own. It was always judged through the lens of the clothing that framed it. One of the most important aspects of medieval clothing was the way it controlled the waist. Belts and girdles, often worn tightly, emphasized a narrow middle. For women, this created the impression of delicacy and refinement. A gown might flow loosely around the legs but be drawn in tightly at the waist with a jeweled belt, making the figure seem balanced and graceful. Men also wore belts, but in their case, the effect was different. It suggested strength and readiness, since belts often held weapons as well as shaping the tunic. In both cases, the belt was not simply practical, but symbolic, creating a body shape that matched ideals of elegance or power. Layers of fabric were another key factor. Medieval clothing often involved multiple garments, from undertunics to outer gowns and cloaks. These layers added volume, creating silhouettes that could exaggerate certain features. For women, wide skirts and long sleeves made the body look fuller and more imposing, especially in noble courts where grandeur was admired. Yet the waist remained controlled, so the contrast between narrow middle and flowing fabric created a striking shape. For men, layers emphasized the breadth of the shoulders or the length of the body, giving an impression of dignity and command. Colors and patterns also shaped the body visually. Darker fabrics could make the figure seem slimmer, while bright colors drew attention to particular areas. Gold embroidery across the chest, for instance, drew the eye upward, highlighting the face and upper body. Stripes or borders along sleeves and hems guided the gaze and created lines of movement. Even when the body beneath was ordinary, the clothing turned it into a canvas, arranging attention where it was most flattering. Headwear, too, played a role in shaping the overall body image. Tall headdresses, such as hennons with long veils, added height and elegance. They made the body appear elongated, giving the impression of slimness and grandeur. For men, hoods and hats added a frame to the face, often suggesting dignity or status. The head was never left unshaped. It was part of the body's silhouette, and by adjusting it, the whole figure was transformed. Jewelry often worked together with clothing to enhance this shaping. A jeweled girdle at the waist emphasized narrowness. A necklace at the throat drew attention upward. Rings and bracelets highlighted the delicacy of the hands. Each accessory was placed carefully, not randomly, to support the body shape created by fabric and belts. The result was a body that appeared not just natural, but carefully arranged to match ideals of harmony and refinement. The role of clothing in shaping beauty was especially clear at court. Noble gatherings were full of gowns that swept across the floor, sleeves that dragged behind, and fabrics that shimmered with silk or brocade. These garments were not practical for work or travel. They were designed to transform bodies into works of art. A noblewoman's figure might be hidden beneath layers, yet those layers created a sense of grandeur. A nobleman's tunic might not reveal his strength, but its cut and belt gave him an air of command. Clothing made people into symbols of their class and their values. The church, as always, had mixed feelings about this. Religious leaders often warned against vanity in dress, accusing people of caring more about fashion than virtue. Yet even in monasteries and convents, clothing still shaped the body, though in a different way. Loose, simple robes created silhouettes of humility, erasing individual features and emphasizing spiritual equality. In this way, clothing could either enhance beauty or deliberately hide it, depending on the values of the setting. Literature and poetry often included descriptions of clothing alongside beauty. A knight might describe his lady not only by her hair or eyes, but by the gown she wore, how it shimmered in the light, or how it shaped her form. Clothing became part of the person's beauty, inseparable from their physical features. In romances, a lady might be recognized by the color of her gown, or the sparkle of her belt as much as by her face. The way her clothing shaped her body was part of the admiration she received. Practical clothing for peasants was, of course, very different. Simpler tunics and dresses shaped the body in less refined ways, often loose and unadorned. This made the contrast with noble clothing even stronger. A peasant's body was seen as plain, while a noble's body, enhanced by layers of fabric and jewels, seemed transformed into something ideal. Clothing thus reinforced social differences, turning the same basic human form into very different images of beauty depending on status. Imagine a medieval feast filled with music and torchlight. Guests move among long tables, their figures flowing in rich fabrics. A noblewoman passes, her waist cinched by a jeweled belt, her gown cascading in folds of silk. Her figure seems taller, grander, more refined than it might in plain clothing. A nobleman greets her, his tunic embroidered in gold, his shoulders appearing broad and commanding beneath the cut of the fabric. Their bodies are not seen as they are, but as the clothing has shaped them, and this is exactly what makes them beautiful in the eyes of their peers. The shaping power of clothing reminds us how beauty ideals are never only about nature. They are about presentation, about how the body is framed and enhanced. In medieval Europe, the ideal body was always partly a creation of fabric, belts, and jewels. It was a collaboration between nature and art, between the person and the clothing they wore. Looking back, we can see that clothing in the Middle Ages functioned as a kind of silent sculptor, carving the human form into admired shapes. It gave the body grandeur, elegance, and harmony, making even ordinary figures appear noble. It turned beauty into performance, where each fold of fabric and each shining belt played a part in telling the story of who someone was. And so, in castles and courts across Europe, beauty was not only born, it was dressed, shaped, and presented. The body was never simply seen. It was framed by fabric, transformed by design, and judged as much by its clothing as by its natural form. In medieval Europe, the church was not just a place of worship, but the central authority that shaped almost every part of life, including how people thought about beauty. It is easy to imagine beauty standards as being created only by fashion or poetry. But in truth, the church's teachings influenced what was considered acceptable, modest, or sinful in appearance. Ideas of pale skin, modest dress, and natural beauty were not only cultural, but also deeply tied to religion. To understand medieval beauty, one must understand how the church's influence shaped it. The church taught that the body was God's creation, and as such, it carried dignity. But at the same time, too much focus on the body was seen as dangerous. Vanity, pride, and lust were constant warnings in sermons. This created a tension. People admired beauty and celebrated it in poetry, art, and daily life, yet they also feared that beauty could lead to sin. For women especially, their appearance was often scrutinized as a reflection of morality. A modest, natural beauty was praised, while excessive decoration could be criticized as prideful or even sinful. Religious leaders sometimes spoke directly against practices such as painting the face, dyeing the hair, or wearing overly ornate clothing. They argued that altering one's natural appearance was a form of deceit, as if trying to trick others into admiring something false. Women who used heavy cosmetics might be compared to temptresses, their beauty portrayed as dangerous to men's souls. This criticism did not stop people from seeking beauty, but it did influence how openly they could display it. Subtlety and moderation became important. A touch of rose on the cheeks, a delicate veil, or a simple necklace could be admired, but anything too bold risked accusations of sin. At the same time, the Church also celebrated certain kinds of beauty, especially when tied to holiness. Saints were often described as radiantly beautiful, their skin clear and their faces glowing with purity. Religious art depicted the Virgin Mary as the ultimate model of beauty, serene, modest, and flawless. Her pale skin, smooth features, and downcast eyes represented humility as well as perfection. For women in particular, Mary became the standard, beautiful without vanity, adorned without excess, perfect yet modest. This religious model had a strong effect on daily life. Noblewomen were expected to balance their desire to appear attractive with the expectation of modesty. They might wear fine gowns, but they were also expected to cover their heads with veils or wimples, signaling respectability. Jewelry could be worn, but not so much that it seemed gaudy. Cosmetics could be used, but only lightly. The message was clear. Beauty was acceptable, even admirable as long as it pointed toward virtue rather than pride. Monastic life offered another perspective on beauty. Nuns wore plain habits, covering their hair and bodies completely, yet accounts of holy women often emphasized their natural beauty. Chroniclers described nuns and saints as glowing with health and purity, even without adornment. Their beauty was framed as a reflection of their inner holiness rather than their outward efforts. This reinforced the idea that true beauty was tied to virtue and character, not to powders or jewels. Men were not free from the Church's influence on beauty, though the scrutiny was less intense. Knights and noblemen were praised for their strength and refinement, but they too were warned against vanity. Long hair, overly decorated clothing, or an excessive concern with appearance could be criticized as unmanly or prideful. A knight was expected to look noble but also modest, balancing elegance with humility. The Church encouraged men to embody dignity rather than showiness. The influence of the Church also extended into art and literature. Religious art set the tone for beauty ideals, with saints and angels painted in serene perfection. Even secular art reflected these standards, often portraying women with downcast eyes, modest poses, and graceful clothing that suggested refinement without excess. Literature, too, often praised women for their modesty as much as for their beauty. A lady who was beautiful but also humble was considered the highest ideal. The tension between beauty and vanity created a delicate balance in daily life. People wanted to look attractive, to wear fine clothes and care for their skin, but they also wanted to avoid condemnation. This is why moderation was so important. A woman might pinch her cheeks to add color rather than paint them heavily. She might wear pearls, which symbolized purity, rather than bright, flashy jewels. A man might wear fine fabrics but avoid too many ornaments. The goal was to be admired, but not suspected of pride. We can imagine this in a medieval court. A noblewoman enters, her gown finely made but not overly extravagant. Her hair is veiled, her jewelry modest, her movements graceful. Guests admire her beauty, noting her pale skin, her smooth features, and her elegance. But what they praise most is that she seems modest and virtuous. Her beauty does not appear vain. It appears natural, as if it reflects her character rather than her vanity. This balance was the true art of beauty in a world shaped by religion. The Church also influenced how ugliness was perceived. Physical deformities or blemishes were sometimes seen as signs of sin or divine punishment. This was not fair, but it reflected the belief that the body revealed the soul. Just as smooth skin and bright eyes suggested virtue, scars or marks could be interpreted as spiritual flaws. Religious teachings reinforce this view, warning people to look beyond appearances but also linking physical and moral perfection. Looking back now, the Church's influence on beauty ideals shows us how deeply morality shaped aesthetics in the Middle Ages. Beauty was never just about looking attractive. It was about signaling virtue, purity, and humility. A woman's veil, a man's modest clothing, or a saint's radiant face all carried layers of meaning that went beyond the surface. And so, in the candlelit halls of medieval Europe, Beauty was always balanced by faith. To be admired was not enough. One had to be admired in the right way. True beauty was tied to humility, moderation, and the reflection of inner virtue. Too much pride risked sin, but just enough modest adornment reflected grace. In the end, the Church's teachings ensured that medieval beauty was not only about the eye, it was also about the soul. In medieval Europe, beauty was admired so deeply that people sometimes risked their health and even their lives in pursuit of it. While many ideals focused on natural features like pale skin, smooth cheeks, or bright eyes, not everyone was born with those qualities. And so, a world of recipes, powders, ointments, and hidden tricks emerged, some of which were harmless while others were shockingly dangerous. These practices reveal the lengths people were willing to go for beauty, even in a time when medicine was limited and knowledge of chemistry was poor. One of the most common and risky pursuits was the quest for pale skin. Pale, unmarked skin was the mark of nobility, and those without it often tried to lighten their faces with powders and pastes. Unfortunately, many of these contained harmful ingredients. Lead-based powders, for example, were sometimes used to create a white complexion. Lead could smooth the skin temporarily, making it look lighter and more flawless, but over time it poisoned the body. Symptoms ranged from headaches and fatigue to damaged organs and, in severe cases, death. Yet, despite these risks, the desire for pale beauty was so strong that people continued to apply such powders. Mercury was another dangerous substance sometimes used in beauty treatments. Known for its reflective, silvery quality, it was mixed into ointments meant to brighten the skin or reduce blemishes. But mercury, like lead, was toxic, slowly poisoning the body. Users might not have understood exactly why they grew ill, but they continued to chase the ideal of smooth, pale skin. In a society where appearance carried so much meaning, the risk seemed worth it. Rouge, used to give color to cheeks and lips, could also be dangerous depending on what it was made from. Harmless versions were made from crushed berries, beet juice, or herbs, but others contained red lead or cinnabar, a mineral form of mercury. These gave a long-lasting, striking red color but also exposed the skin to toxins. A woman who appeared glowing at a feast might in fact be slowly harming herself with each application. Again, moderation and subtlety were preached, but the temptation of a stronger, more dramatic effect often led people to choose the more dangerous option. Hair care, too, carried its risks. Blonde hair was especially admired, as it was associated with youth, purity, and even angelic qualities. But not everyone had golden locks, and so some turned to dyes and bleaching methods. Mixtures of lye, vinegar, or even urine were used to lighten hair. These substances could burn the scalp, weaken the hair, and cause permanent damage, but they remained popular among those desperate to match the golden-haired ideal. Wigs and hairpieces made from lighter hair were safer, but they lacked the authenticity that true blonde hair carried. Eyes, so highly valued for their brightness, were also the subject of dangerous attempts at enhancement. Some believed that drops made from belladonna, a poisonous plant, could make the pupils larger and the eyes appear darker and more luminous. The effect was real, but the risks were severe: blurred vision, hallucinations, and even blindness. Still, the allure of enchanting eyes tempted some to use it, showing how beauty ideals could lead to practices that threatened the very features they were meant to enhance. Skin treatments extended beyond powders and paints. To fight blemishes, people experimented with harsh scrubs, poultices, and even caustic chemicals. Sulfur mixtures were sometimes applied to clear the skin, while acidic substances like vinegar or lemon were used to peel away marks. While some remedies may have helped, others irritated or scarred the skin, leaving it worse than before. Yet the stigma of blemishes was so strong that people continued to risk harsher treatments in hopes of achieving smoothness. Clothing and accessories, though safer, sometimes created their own dangers. Tight lacing, meant to narrow the waist, could restrict breathing and strain the body. While not as extreme as later corsetry, these early attempts still caused discomfort and sometimes harm. Heavy jewelry, layered clothing, and tall headdresses also placed strain on the body, creating aches and fatigue. Beauty often came at a physical price, even when it did not involve toxins. The Church sometimes spoke out against these dangerous practices, condemning not only the vanity, but also the risks. Priests warned women against painting their faces with deadly powders or dyeing their hair with harsh substances. They argued that altering the body God had given was both sinful and foolish. Yet even these warnings did not fully stop the pursuit of beauty. In noble courts, the admiration of pale faces and golden hair continued to encourage the use of risky methods. At the same time, safer remedies did exist. Herbalists and healers offered gentler treatments: rosewater to soothe, honey to soften, or almond oil to nourish. These were less dramatic but safer, and they show that medieval people were not ignorant of natural care. Still, the dangerous methods often promised quicker or more striking results, and so they remained popular among those desperate to meet ideals. The contrast between the risks and the rewards highlights just how powerful beauty ideals were. People were willing to risk their health to appear pale, smooth, or youthful. In some cases, the very things meant to enhance beauty slowly destroyed it, as skin was damaged, hair was lost, or health declined. Yet the pressure of social expectations was too strong to resist. In a world where appearance could signal class, morality, and status, beauty was worth the danger. We can imagine a noble gathering where women arrive with luminous pale skin, flushed cheeks, and golden hair. They look perfect in the candlelight, admired by all around them. Yet behind the glow lies the hidden truth: powders of lead, dyes of lye, and rouges of cinnabar. Their beauty is dazzling but dangerous, maintained at great cost. Guests may not know the secrets of their appearance, but those women carry the weight of the risks they have taken. Looking back now, the dangerous beauty practices of medieval Europe remind us of the lengths people will go to for admiration. They also show us how little has changed. Even today, many endure risky treatments or use harmful substances to pursue modern ideals of beauty. The tools have changed, but the desire remains the same: to match the standard of the age, even at a cost. In the Middle Ages, beauty was never just surface. It was a reflection of status, morality, and identity. And when the ideals became unreachable naturally, people turned to powders, dyes, and poisons to bridge the gap. The result was often a paradox: the pursuit of beauty that led to harm, the search for perfection that left scars. Yet the stories of these practices remind us of how deeply beauty has always mattered, and how it has always demanded sacrifice. In thinking about the beauty ideals of medieval Europe, it becomes clear that many of them are not so different from the ideals we hold today. Pale skin, smooth faces, bright eyes, silky hair, a balanced body shape. These are qualities still praised in modern times, even if the methods of achieving them have changed. Yet, in the Middle Ages, beauty was not just about personal choice or fashion. It was deeply tied to class, morality, and even spirituality. To look beautiful was to send a message about who you were, what you believed, and where you belonged in society. One of the strongest similarities between then and now is the idea that beauty signals health. Medieval people admired rosy cheeks, bright eyes, and smooth skin because they suggested vitality and strength. Today, we still equate a glowing complexion and lively expression with wellness. The difference lies in interpretation. Where medieval people might have seen blemishes as evidence of sin or divine punishment, we understand them as medical or environmental issues. Yet the admiration for healthy-looking features has never changed. Class also played a major role in shaping ideals, and this too continues today in subtler ways. In the Middle Ages, pale skin showed that a person did not work outdoors, while soft hands revealed a life free from physical labor. These signs of leisure marked someone as wealthy and noble. In the modern world, wealth still shapes beauty, though the markers have shifted. Expensive skincare, cosmetic procedures, or gym memberships can create appearances that signal privilege. Just as in medieval times, beauty remains connected to status, even if the signals look different. The Church's influence on medieval beauty reminds us of another key difference. In those centuries, beauty was judged not only by appearance but also by morality. A woman who looked modest and natural was admired, while one who wore heavy cosmetics might be accused of vanity or deceit. Today, the link between beauty and morality is weaker, but echoes remain. People still make assumptions about character based on appearance, whether someone looks natural, fake, humble, or proud. In both ages, beauty has always been read as more than surface. The lengths people went to in order to achieve ideals also connect the past to the present. Medieval women risked their health with lead powders, mercury ointments, and dangerous hair dyes. Modern people undergo cosmetic surgeries, chemical treatments, and extreme diets, often facing risks of their own. In both cases, the desire to meet the ideal outweighs the dangers. The tools change, but the sacrifices remain. This persistence shows how powerful beauty ideals can be, shaping not only how people see each other, but also what they are willing to endure. At the same time, there are important differences. Medieval beauty ideals were heavily influenced by religion, symbolism, and literature. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate model of beauty, pure, pale, modest, and serene. Poets praised high foreheads, long golden hair, and delicate hands because these features aligned with cultural symbols of virtue and refinement. Today, our ideals are shaped more by media, celebrities, and global trends. The sources have shifted, but the process is similar. Beauty is defined by the powerful voices of the age, whether they are priests and poets or actors and influencers. Looking back, it is striking how much meaning was loaded into every feature. A straight nose was not just a nose, it was a sign of harmony and nobility. Rosy cheeks were not just healthy, they were symbols of innocence and virtue. Smooth hands meant refinement and high birth, while rough hands marked toil and lower status. Every part of the body was read like a text, filled with signs to be interpreted. In some ways, this has softened in modern times, yet we still carry traces of it whenever we judge someone's character or lifestyle based on their looks. The reflection also reminds us that beauty ideals are always shifting. In the Middle Ages, plumpness was admired at some times and slimness at others. Today, body ideals shift just as quickly, with trends rising and falling in only a few years. What remains constant is that beauty is never fixed. It changes with culture, history, and values. What was once admired may later be forgotten, and what was once mocked may later be praised. Beauty is not only in the eye of the beholder, but also in the hands of the age. It is also important to remember that not everyone fit or pursued these ideals. Peasants working in fields could not maintain pale skin or delicate hands, yet they had their own measures of attractiveness, rooted in strength, resilience, and health. Medieval beauty ideals often belonged to the noble classes, written in poetry and painted in manuscripts, not in the daily lives of most people. The contrast between ideals and reality was as strong then as it is now, reminding us that beauty standards have always excluded as much as they included. Imagine, for a moment, a medieval hall filled with nobles. Women glide in gowns that shape their bodies, their cheeks faintly rosy, their hair braided with care. Men stand tall in tunics, their eyes bright in the torchlight, their belts emphasizing their form. Every detail is judged: the smoothness of skin, the refinement of features, the modesty of dress. To those present, this is beauty. Yet outside the castle walls, in villages and fields, a different kind of beauty exists. Sun-browned faces, strong hands, and bodies shaped by labor. Both are real, but only one is recorded as the ideal. Looking at these ideals from a modern perspective, they may seem strange. High foreheads achieved by shaving hairlines, thin or missing eyebrows, and dangerous powders all feel distant from today's practices. Yet, when we think more deeply, we realize that our own world is not so different. People still change their appearances to fit ideals, still risk their health for beauty, still judge others by how they look. The story of medieval beauty is, in many ways, the story of human beauty across time, a reflection of our endless desire to embody what society tells us is most admired. And so, as we end this journey through pale faces, high foreheads, golden hair, delicate hands, bright eyes, and dangerous powders, we come to a simple truth. Beauty in the Middle Ages was never just about looking pretty. It was about identity, class, morality, and culture. It was about what people valued most, written onto the body itself. To study their ideals is to glimpse their world, to see what they hoped for, what they feared, and what they admired. When we look at beauty then and beauty now, we find both differences and striking similarities. The details change, but the desire remains. Across centuries, humans have always shaped their bodies, adorned their faces, and risked their health in pursuit of ideals that go beyond appearance. Beauty has always been a language, telling stories of who we are and who we wish to be. And so, our journey through the strange and fascinating beauty ideals of medieval Europe comes to an end. From pale skin and high foreheads to dangerous powders and golden hair, we've seen how people in the Middle Ages went to surprising lengths just to feel beautiful. Some of their choices may sound strange to us now, even shocking. Yet, if you think about it, people today still follow trends, still chase after ideals, and still go to great effort just to match what society admires. The details may change, but the story is timeless. Beauty has always been more than appearance. It has been a language, a way of showing status, identity, and even morality. And when we look back, it reminds us that every age creates its own standards, some harmless, some dangerous, but always deeply human. If you've enjoyed this calm little trip through history, I'd love for you to join me again. Please take a moment to like this video if it relaxed you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps keep this channel growing and allows me to share more of these gentle, sleepy journeys into the past. For now, close your eyes, let your mind drift, and imagine the candlelit halls of the Middle Ages fading into quiet. May the strange tales of history keep you company as you rest. Good night, and I'll see you in the next chapter.